Chapter 1811. Lord Bird left and disappeared. Bufang's life returned to normal. He worked at sunrise and rested at sunset. He cooked natural delicacies and enjoyed the delicacies brought by nature. It was simple and unpretentious. Xiao Bai's mechanical eyes dimmed, and it seemed to have become clumsier. Xiaobai would occasionally climb onto Xiao Bai's head and turn its nimble chicken head, clucking a few times. Occasionally, it would shake its chicken butt and run into the fields, chasing after bugs. The originally extraordinary octatic treasure's chicken had become like a wild pheasant on the mountain. Bufang was very satisfied, or rather, he enjoyed this kind of salted fish-like life. When he was bored, he would study all kinds of delicacies. Studying delicacies became his only pleasure during this period of time. Outside the mountain, it was a chaotic world. All kinds of wars broke out continuously, and the tragic killings caused the flames of war to spread all over the place. There was no sun or moon in the mountain. Spring, summer, autumn, and winter changed continuously. He hadn't left the mountain for a long time and didn't go to the village to exchange for rice. White snow fluttered down from the sky and landed on the ground in front of the wooden house, covering the ground with a thick layer of cotton-padded jacket. Xiao Bai sat in the courtyard and stared blankly, as if it had been made into a snowman by the white snow. Xiao Bai had a handful of snow on its head as it ran on the snowy ground. Bufang wore a thick cotton-padded jacket and exhaled a mouthful of white air. Gurgle, gurgle. The flames rose slightly, and the hot water in the pot emitted steam. Bufang took a teacup and sprinkled a few strands of blackened tea leaf. This tea was a specialty of the mountain. It was produced in very small quantities and was discovered by Bufang by chance. He poured the boiling water into the teacup. The tea leaves were soaked and the fragrance of the tea spread out, lingering in the air. The tea leaves swirled in the cup. The color of the tea gradually turned from transparent to dark green. It looked very comfortable. Bufang held the cup with both hands and sat on the chair with a cotton-padded jacket draped over his shoulders. He looked at the pure white snow outside. Days passed. Bufang didn't know how long he had been in the mountain. Chi. He drank a mouthful of tea, and the warmth dispersed the coldness in his body. He sat on the chair for a long time. Only then did Bufang return to his house. He took a hoe and went up the mountain. Although there were fewer ingredients on the mountain during winter, he didn't care. Finding the ingredients was fate. Xiao Bai followed them quietly. The man and the puppet climbed up the mountain. On this snowy day, the mountain was covered with pure white snow. It was indeed difficult to find delicious ingredients in the vast expanse of whiteness. In the distance, a snow rabbit was hopping around. Bufang saw it but did not move. He carried the hoe and quietly followed the snow rabbit. The snow rabbit jumped all the way. Very quickly, he burrowed into the nest. There were a few bunnies clustered around him, and their cute little heads were spinning around. Bufang smiled. He took a look from afar, picked up his hoe, and walked on the snow. On the snowy mountain, there were many other ingredients besides the snow rabbit. Winter mushrooms were one of them. The small mushroom clung to the tree trunk, and the white snow fell down like a flower blooming in the white light. Bufang was happily picking the mushrooms. He put them into the basket. Every winter, he would come here to pick the mushrooms. At this time, the mushrooms were the most beautiful. After Bufang picked them, he would dry them in the sun and spread them out for later use. Of course, the mushrooms were also very delicious when cooked. He picked the mushrooms. Bufang did not leave directly. He walked on the mountain. Soon, a hungry wild wolf stared at Bufang. Then, he leaped toward Bufang. The wild wolf was hungry. Bufang was also hungry. Xiao Bai was clumsy. But after one slap, the wild wolf could not get up. Bufang happily tied the wild wolf and threw it into the basket. Because the basket was much heavier, he let Xiao Bai carry it. Although the harvest was good, Bufang did not plan to go back. He came to the pond in the mountain. The pond was wrapped in a thick layer of ice. Fish were the fattest in winter. Of course, Bufang would not let go of such delicious food. He made a hole in the ice, and after a while, a few plump fish fell into the basket. Satisfied, Bufang left the pond. He hummed a song as he left the mountain amidst the pure white snow. It had to be said that Bufang had hummed songs for so many years, but he still did not improve. He returned to the house. The day in winter was always very short. It was getting dark soon, and the temperature was getting colder. Bufang made a fire and cleaned the fish. The fat fish was patted by Bufang. From the room, he took out the dried mushrooms, which he had prepared in the past years. The dried mushrooms had a unique fragrance. Xiao Chun took the mushrooms and placed them on top of the fish that had been processed. They were put into the pot to steam. Hot air rose up in the mountain. Clatter! The white snow was crushed. The sharp light kept bursting out. White snow fell rapidly from the tree trunks. The terrifying saber-chi rampaged through the forest, and countless trees were chopped into pieces. The sound of heavy panting rang out. A figure in blood-stained armor had a big gash on his shoulder, starting from his back and extending to his waist. Hot blood kept spilling from it. It sprinkled on the pure white snow, causing the snow to melt. His hair was disheveled and his face was pale. The man was struggling to climb in the snow. From time to time, he would look back. His pursuers were chasing him. Swoosh! The arrowheads emitted a cold light, like deadly arrows in the dark night. They chased after the badly injured man who was climbing quickly. Puff! Puff! Arrows fell to the ground one after another. The snow flew. The man's pupils suddenly shrank. His body rolled up, and a great force rushed out of the snow. His body spun. An arrow whizzed past, brushing past his face. Dugu Wushuang. You can't escape. You're the top of the 10 great swordsmen of the empire. Running away like a stray dog is a disgrace to your name. A faint voice rang out. Then, in the dense forest behind the man, the assassins in black walked on the snow. Their bodies were bursting with true energy. They moved extremely fast. The badly injured man spat out a mouthful of blood. With a cold snort, he continued to climb forward. He swung the sword in his hand. A sharp sword chi suddenly exploded, slashing towards those assassins in the distance. At this moment, several of them reached out at the same time. One sword after another fell into their hands. They raised their swords. Puff! The swords tore through the snowflakes. They collided with the incoming sword energy. The swords bent and bounced off with a great force. This caused the assassins to retreat a few steps. Their swords left no trace. The cultivation base of these assassins was quite high. After all, the man was seriously injured. The more he activated it, the weaker his aura became. The assassins approached. They fought him in the mountains. The battle was earth-shattering. The ground was covered with blood, and countless trees were cut into nothingness by the sword energy. The whole mountain seemed to be shaking. The swords collided with each other, clanging sounds echoing. After a long time, the battle was over. Only the unrecognizable corpses of the assassins were left on the ground. Footprints of different depths gradually spread toward the depths of the dense forest. The wind and snow blew. The footprints were drowned under the white snow. Gulp, gulp. Bufang checked the time and turned off the stove. He opened the steamer. Suddenly, rolling hot air surged out of the steamer. The hot air was like a rolling ball of energy in the dark night, gradually dissipating. It smells good. Bufang sniffed the fragrance in the air. The fragrance of dried mushrooms mixed with the fragrance of fish. The tender fish wrapped under the smooth fish skin looked very delicious. In addition to this steamed fish, Bufang also stir-fried mushroom slices. The slightly sticky sauce fell, and the mushroom slices seemed to shine. Fresh mushrooms and dried mushrooms had a completely different taste. Bufang placed the dish on the table. He turned and returned to the wooden hut. He took a jar of wine from the cellar. This was the wine brewed by Bufang. He had been brewing it for several years. He would only take a sip when he was satisfied. The delicious taste of the wine intoxicated Bufang. He had brewed a lot of wine, so it could be said that Bufang had a deep understanding of good wine. However, in Bufang's opinion, wine brewing in the past was made with a unique brewing method. In fact, wine brewing needed to be paved with emotion. The intensity of the emotion depended on the brewer. In the past, Bufang's feelings for wine brewing were more superficial. Of course, even if it was just the technique, it was still very amazing. The jar of wine was not big. It was about the size of a fist. Bufang happily slapped the lid open. A strong aroma of wine spread from it. Wu Shuang was very tired. He felt that he had lost too much blood. He almost fainted. The path to immortality, the singing, he, Wu Shuang, was also on the verge of death. Sighing helplessly, he felt very helpless. Could it be that the sword god of this generation was going to die in this remote and uninhabited mountain? Wu Shuang smiled bitterly. Perhaps many years later, people would name this mountain Mount Wu Shuang. After all, he, the sword god, was lying on this mountain. In the distance, a little flame rose. It flowed slowly. The flame gradually spread in his eyes, and he felt a little dizzy. Wu Shuang coughed up a mouthful of blood. Drops of blood fell on his snow-white face and dyed it the color of plum blossoms. Plop! He fell to his knees. His whole face was buried in the snow. His messy hair spread over his face, and he could only hear his own breathing and the beating of his heart. "I'm going to die," Wu Shuang sighed. Suddenly, a fat chicken flapped its wings and walked over on the snow. The chicken seemed to observe him curiously for a while. It circled around his body. Wu Shuang could not move at all, but he could sense the lively, fat chicken in front of him. Suddenly, the fat chicken stepped on his head with its claw and started jumping around his body. Wu Shuang was so angry that he almost died. He rolled his eyes. He finally could not stand it anymore. "Little eight, stop it." A thin figure walked out of the flame. A faint voice rang out. Wu Shuang's consciousness was blurred. In the end, he only felt a cold iron palm fall on him and pick him up like a chicken. With his strong consciousness, Wu Shuang opened his eyes. In an instant, a lump of iron with an overturned iron skin appeared in his eyes. Wu Shuang was taken aback and fainted. "Xiao Bai, you scared me." The corner of Bufang's mouth twitched. "I can't believe someone came to this mountain in the middle of the night." Glancing at the wounded man, Bufang did not leave him to die. He asked Xiao Bai to bring the man back to the hut. He threw him in the yard. Bufang sat on a chair, rubbed his hands, and exhaled a puff of white smoke. He was ready to eat. Fish steamed with mushrooms was absolutely delicious. Bufang picked up the fish with his chopsticks. It was soft and fragrant. In an instant, it melted in his mouth like juice, a mouthful of fish and a mouthful of wine. When the cool wine entered his stomach, it was like a ball of fire, making all the pores on Bufang's body open. Little Eight wandered around Bufang, begging for food. Bufang threw a piece of fish to Little Eight. Then, he poured a glass of wine. She walked to the side of the heavily injured man. Looking at the latter's miserable appearance, he sighed. He poured the wine into the man's mouth. Chapter 1812. The snow rustled down. What followed was silence. It was as if the dust of history had been sealed. Wu Shuang woke up. His ears were extremely quiet, so quiet that he thought he might be in hell. He moved, and his body made a noise as he touched the firewood. "Oh? I can move?" Wu Shuang was stunned. He looked at his body. On his body, the wound that had originally covered his shoulder all the way to his waist had completely healed. "The fatal wound has healed overnight?" Wu Shuang's breath caught in his throat. He looked around and found himself in the woodshed. "Which expert saved me? I'm afraid only an immortal has the power to save this kind of injury, right?" He stood up. His blood and energy were a little unstable, but he did not care. He picked up the sword he had thrown on the ground. It was his lifeblood and his pride as a sword god. Stroking the sword, Wu Shuang exhaled and said, Since the damned heaven doesn't want to take my life, I'll cut it down with my sword. He pushed open the shabby door of the woodshed. Wushuang walked through the door. The ground was covered with soft snow. In the yard, a fat chicken was flapping its wings happily. It was the chicken that had stepped on his head before he passed out yesterday. Wushuang narrowed his eyes. "You're awake? If you're awake, pack up and leave." An indifferent voice resounded. Wushuang paused. He turned his head and saw a thin young man sitting on a chair with a bowl of hot fish soup in his hand, gulping it down. Beside him, a lump of iron with its iron skin flying around quietly stood there. "Where am I?" Wushuang frowned. He could see that there was no fluctuation of true energy in the thin young man. There was no doubt that the young man was a mortal, not a cultivator. The same went for the puppet. There was no fluctuation of true energy, so it was probably a mortal as well. Perhaps this young man is the disciple of the senior who saved me? Is the immortal master at home? I'll never forget your kindness. Wushuang nodded slightly at Bufang. However, Bufang just glanced at him indifferently and did not say anything. He drank a mouthful of fish soup and exhaled a mouthful of hot air. The atmosphere was silent for a moment. "I'm Dugu Wushuang, the sword god of the empire." Wushuang frowned and said in a more serious tone. "There's no such thing as an immortal master. Now that you've recovered, you should leave. It's fate that you were able to find this place in the vast wilderness." Bufang took a bite of fish and said. He stood up and walked towards the wooden hut. Wushuang took a deep breath. This mortal? What arrogance! However, Wushuang did not cause any trouble. Instead, he gave Bufang a deep look. He walked to the wooden hut and sat down quietly. "Since you don't want to tell me, then I will wait here for Master Immortal's return," Wushuang said. His heart was burning. Searching for immortals, searching for immortals. The path to immortality was hard to find, and everyone in the world was captivated by it. Since he was fated to meet the immortal master, how could he leave so easily? Xiao Bai turned its mechanical head and glanced at Wushuang with its dull mechanical eyes. 80 cackled with a teasing look in its eyes. Inside the wooden hut, Bufang came out in a thick cotton-padded jacket. "Why are you still here?" He frowned when he saw Wushuang sitting in a chair. "I'm here to see Master Immortal," Wushuang said. "I told you there's no immortal master. You'd better leave now, or I'll kick you out," Bufang said. He had saved Wushuang because it was fate that the latter would find his wooden hut in the vast wilderness. It was just a matter of a cup of wine. Bufang did not want to leave anyone in the wooden hut. Wushuang was displeased. "You're so unreasonable, young man. I'm here to see Master Immortal. If he comes back and refuses to see me, it's fine, but why are you kicking me out?" Wushuang said. How could he give up the chance to become an immortal? Although Wushuang's swordsmanship was extraordinary, he was still far from being a legendary immortal. He had tried to break through the void with his martial arts, but he failed. From then on, he knew he was still far from becoming an immortal. "I'm unreasonable? If I weren't, you would have turned into a pile of bones and fed to the wolves in the mountains." Bufang shook his head, the corner of his mouth curling up. He found it funny. 80. Kick him out, Bufang said lightly. After that, he turned into the wooden hut, picked up the basket, and was about to go out for a trip. "Kick me out." The corner of Wushuang's mouth twitched. Bufang was just a mortal. There's only a wooden puppet and a chicken here. Who's going to kick him out? Wushuang did not mind. Bufang, on the other hand, went straight out with the basket on his back. Cluck, cluck, cluck. All of a sudden Wushuang froze. In the distance, the fat chicken's eyes suddenly became very sharp. It lowered its head slightly. Then, it slapped its wings hard on its body. Taking big strides, it began to gallop at full speed. It ran faster and faster. Cluck! A chicken crow rang out. 80's claws stepped on the snow. The snowy ground instantly exploded, revealing a large chicken claw. Then, 80 leaped into the air, spread its claws, and kicked Wushuang in the face. What the F***ck? Wushuang was dumbfounded. He had no time to react. A fat chicken kicked him in the face, and his body flew backward uncontrollably. He was thrown out of the wooden hut. Bam! Snow swirled in the air. Wushuang stared blankly at the sky. He was kicked out of the hut by King Chicken. He was so sad that he wanted to cry. Bufang walked out of the hut with the basket on his back and a bamboo stick in his hand. Xiao Bai followed him. He glanced at Wushuang, who was lying in the snow and doubting his life. Expressionlessly, he continued to walk. Not long after, his figure disappeared in the mountain road that was shrouded in clouds and mist. Wushuang rolled over and got to his feet. He glanced at Bufang, who had disappeared into the distance. Now, his heart was pounding. He was wrong. He had been wrong all along. His first impression was that an immortal should be an old man. Little did he know that this Bufang, who had no aura of true energy, was an immortal. He could not believe that such a powerful fat chicken would obey Bufang's words. This showed that Bufang was definitely extraordinary. Wushuang rose to his feet. However, before he could stand up straight, 80 ran up, jumped up, spread its claws, and kicked him in the face. Wushuang was dumbfounded. He was kicked away again. Snow fell all over the ground. Wushuang was furious. He was the #1 sword god of the empire, and yet he was kicked by a chicken? Even if he died in battle, he would never be defeated by a chicken. Cluck! Snow swirled in the air. Wushuang fell to the snow again. Bufang went deep into the mountain this time, and did not come back for a while. He went to the top of the mountain and spent the night there. Finally, he dug up a huge rock with a hoe. He dug out a jar of wine. After 3 years of brewing, it's finally a success. The corner of Bufang's mouth twitched. Buried at the top of the mountain, the wine had been baptized by the essence of heaven and earth. It was definitely extraordinary. He lifted a small corner of the lid. A strong aroma of wine poured out of it. Taking a deep breath, Bufang was intoxicated. At this moment, at the foot of the mountain, clouds rolled, and a magnificent sea of clouds emerged. It seemed that purple smoke was coming from the east and converging into the jar of wine. The jar of wine exuded a majestic aura. Bufang's eyes narrowed. Even with the most ordinary ingredients, he could make a world-shaking wine. He sat cross-legged at the top of the mountain. Snow swirled in the air. It fell with a rustle. Bufang poured a glass of wine. The wine was blue as the sky. Bufang took a sip. The rich aroma of wine immediately rushed into his limbs and bones. Bufang felt a throb. This sip of wine contained the essence of his many years of accumulation. It might not contain any emotion, but inexplicably it made his eyes bright. He took a sip of wine and watched the surging sea of clouds. Bufang's heart was as calm as still water. How should he walk the path of the god of cooking? Should he cut off his 7 emotions and 6 desires like Soul God? Should he walk the ruthless path? But could heartless delicacies really reach the peak? Or, like what Bufang had thought before, gathering the best delicacies in the world, he could cook the most delicious dishes and become the god of cooking? Maybe both were wrong. The real god of cooking wasn't like what he had imagined. Bufang drank in silence. He watched the clouds roll and move. The next day, Bufang went down the mountain. The clouds were so deep that no one knew where he was. However, Bufang's bamboo stick gently tapped and found the way back. He returned to the wooden hut. Bufang was bewildered. In the distance, a figure was kneeling in the snow. The pure white snow had already covered his body, as if wrapping him up into a snowman. 80 held a chicken wing and stroked its chicken leg, walking back and forth in a leisurely manner. It seemed to sense Bufang's return. 80 took a step forward and swooped toward Bufang at full speed. With a cluck, it leaped to its feet. Bufang raised his hand and caught it by the neck. "Why haven't you left yet?" Bufang threw 80 onto Xiao Bai's head and looked at Wushuang, who was kneeling on the ground. Wushuang stared at 80 with a resentful look on his face. His face was covered with chicken claw marks. "Senior, I was wrong." Wushuang knelt on the ground and said to Bufang, "You can leave now." Bufang shook his head and said indifferently. He strode forward and stepped into the wooden hut. Washing vegetables and cooking, a series of movements were as smooth as flowing water. Soon, a rich aroma wafted out and spread between heaven and earth. Wushuang sniffed the aroma. A strong sense of hunger came from his stomach. How could it smell so good? Wasn't it just a simple dish of stir-fried delicacies? As the #1 sword god in the capital, he had tasted all kinds of delicacies, but he had never smelled such a delicious aroma. Bufang ignored him. After he finished cooking, he began to drink and eat. As he ate, Bufang could not help but frown. He sighed. He put down his wine glass. "It's been a long time since I've had delicious rice. I miss it," Bufang muttered. He finished the meal in a relaxed manner. Then, he cleared the dishes. He put on his bamboo hat and carried the basket, which was filled with swimming, fat fish. It was time to go down the mountain and exchange some rice with the villagers. He saw that Bufang was about to go out again. Wushuang's face darkened. "This immortal master. Can he bear to see me kneel here all the time? Yes. He really can't bear to see me kneel here." 80 swung its drumstick in front of him. Wushuang felt sad. Bufang grabbed his bamboo stick and walked down the mountain. Wushuang's eyes lit up. Immortal Master is going down the mountain? With this thought in mind, Wushuang did not kneel again. Climbing to his feet, he patted his numb knees and swiftly followed behind Zhang Xian with his sword in hand. He followed Bufang from a distance, not daring to disturb Bufang. Bufang went down the mountain and walked toward the village according to his memory. After so many years, he wondered if the villagers still remembered him. Although Bufang had lost his cultivation, however, he knew that Wushuang was following him. He didn't care. If she wanted to follow, then let her. He walked along the muddy road. The shadow of the village was right in front of him. When Wushuang saw the direction in which Bufang was heading, a strange expression appeared on his face. He wanted to say something but hesitated, but after thinking about it, he did not continue. Bufang came to the village. An ice-cold chill surged over. This made Bufang frown. The village was in a mess and dilapidated. The farm tools were covered in pure white snow, and some of the houses had collapsed. It was extremely dilapidated. The whole village was deserted. It looked like a deserted village. Immortal Master, I don't know what kind of entanglement you have with this village, but it was slaughtered 3 years ago. 300 people were killed, Wushuang sighed. Chapter 1813. Of the 300 people in the village, not a single one will be spared. Wushuang's voice was heavy when he said this. In troubled times, human lives were as worthless as grass. He looked at the deserted village covered in snow. It might have once been inhabited, but now it was in ruins. In troubled times, everyone was seeking survival, and the most miserable ones were these mortals. Wushuang fell silent. It was not that he didn't want to speak, but he couldn't. A fear born in the depths of his soul made it difficult for him to even breathe. A clang rang out. The sword fell to the ground. Wushuang fell to the ground, his eyes wide as he stared at Bufang in horror. At this moment, this mortal seemed to be as terrifying as a heavenly god. Immortal Master, Wushuang opened his mouth and struggled to make a sound. It was as if a hand had grabbed his throat. Suddenly, the terrible aura disappeared. He relaxed. Although it was a snowy day, his whole body was soaked with cold sweat, and beads of sweat rolled down his forehead. This time, when he looked at Bufang, he did not doubt him at all. Bufang sighed. He felt lost. Looking at the white deserted village, his emotions were somewhat complicated. At that moment, he accidentally revealed his state of mind, which terrified Wushuang. After all, Bufang was once an existence who had reached the peak of the universe. A chaotic saint was supreme no matter where he was. Even though Bufang had lost all his strength, just his state of mind and a wisp of his will were enough to make people feel terrible pressure. This was the saying that a starving camel was still bigger than a horse. Snowflakes danced in the air. Time and space seemed to have become very quiet. Wushuang sat on the ground, gasping for breath. It seemed that only the sound of his breathing could be heard. Suddenly, he let out a sigh, which made him feel extremely shocked. "Go and find a pheasant." Bufang's faint voice rang out. Wushuang immediately felt relieved, as if he had been pardoned. He answered and scrambled towards the wilderness in the distance. Bufang sat cross-legged on the ground and looked at the barren village with a complicated gaze. The voices and smiles of the villagers were still floating in front of him. The simple villagers left a deep impression on Bufang. Big aunt, big uncle, old village chief. One figure after another seemed to float past his face. Bufang exhaled. Ashes to ashes, dust to dust. Perhaps this was the fate of mortals. Soon Wushuang returned. He was carrying a pheasant in his hand. He handed the pheasant to Bufang, his face full of respect and apprehension. Before, he had only guessed that Bufang was an immortal master. But in that instant just now, he felt as if he had fallen into death with just a thought. Bufang must be an immortal master. Moreover, he was a super-powerful immortal master. Searching for immortals, searching for immortals. Wasn't he searching for immortals? Bufang took the pheasant. Under Wushuang's astonished gaze, he began to process it. Bufang dug out a black wok that was covered in dust from the barren village. After cleaning it up, he set up a wok in the village. Flames rose, dispelling much of the cold in the surroundings. Wushuang did not know what Bufang was going to do. Bufang asked him to find another chicken monkey, so he sat quietly in the distance, waiting for Bufang's orders. However, Bufang did not give him any orders. Instead, he went about his own business. The pheasant was processed. Its feathers were plucked, and its flesh was gradually hardened after being boiled in hot water. Bufang's movements did not slow down. He was still processing the ingredient. Not only the pheasant, but also the fat fish Bufang had prepared. Removing scales, cutting open the abdomen, and removing the internal organs. Bufang's movements were as smooth as flowing water. At this moment, Bufang was like a simple chef, cooking seriously. Wushuang did not dare to disturb Bufang. He could only watch quietly. Bufang's movements were fast, and a fragrance filled the air. However, as he sniffed the fragrance, a hint of sorrow came into Wushuang's eyes. Shocked, he stimulated his body with his sword intent. The fragrance can affect one's mind? Wushuang was horrified, and he felt that Bufang was more and more mysterious. Soon, 2 dishes were cooked. One was a golden roast chicken, and the other was a fragrant steamed fish. With 1 dish in each hand, Bufang placed the 2 dishes in the snow. A rich fragrance spread in all directions. However, it seemed to carry an oppressive sadness. Bufang sat in front of the 2 dishes. He did not eat. He was lost in thought. He had retired to this planet and returned to the life of a mortal, but mortals would eventually return to dust. What should Bufang do in the future? Lord Bird had asked Bufang what would happen if he, Bufang, became a pile of dust in a few hundred years. Bufang's answer had been carefree. Now, looking at the barren village, a sense of loneliness suddenly spread. Death was lonely. If he died, what would happen to his old friends? You, Lord Go, Hades' era, who were in seclusion, what would happen to them? If they learned of his death, they would be very sad. The annihilation of the villagers was enough to make Bufang grieve, not to mention other things. Bufang raised his hand and covered his chest. His heart ached slightly. The pain seemed to come from the depths of his soul. Soul God and the great path of the primitive universe have proven that only the ruthless path can set foot on the peak. But I'm addicted to emotions like a fish that has lost its way. Bufang's eyes were filled with confusion. Bufang also wanted to walk the ruthless path, but he found that he could not. He could not be ruthless. Even though he had lived in seclusion in the mountains for several years, his emotions still existed. Perhaps he was a hypocritical person from the very beginning. He did not like to smile, talk, and had a poker face. But the feelings of the heart could not lie. If he were really ruthless, he would not have so many old friends by his side. The great path of the primitive universe and the soul god were all alone. They were invincible in heaven and earth, but they were lonely in the universe. Bufang was lucky. He had many people around him. Lord Go, Era, Xiaopi Yu, Xiaobai, Xiao Xiaolong, Xiao Yinyu, familiar names came to mind. Bufang shook his head. His face was bitter. He stood up. The barren village was still as quiet as before. Bufang put his palms together, bowed slightly, and bid farewell to the villagers who used to be his friends. Behind Bufang, Wushuang widened his eyes. He saw spots of bright light suddenly flash in the barren village. Many figures appeared in the sky, walking and bustling about. The busy scene of the barren village that had disappeared suddenly reappeared. It was like a projection in the river of time. After a long time, everything disappeared. The barren village was still dilapidated, and the snow had swept away the dust of history. With his hands clasped behind his back, Bufang left the village. Step by step, he returned to the mountain. Wushuang took a deep breath. He was extremely shocked. Without hesitation, he turned his head and followed Bufang. The road back to the mountain was covered with snow. The two of them returned to the hut halfway up the mountain. It was late at night. The light in Bufang's hut went out. He had fallen asleep. Wushuang was in the woodshed, unable to calm down for a long time. He knew that his immortal fate had appeared, and he had to seize it. If he did not seize it, he would miss it forever. That night. Soon it was over. Wushuang opened his eyes and heard rustling outside the door. He grabbed his sword and rushed out. In the yard, Bufang was carrying a thick bag. The fat chicken was stuffed in Bufang's chest, so only its head could be seen. Xiao Bai also carried a bag. His mechanical eyes dim as he stood beside Bufang. Is he going on a long journey? Wushuang was shocked. He grabbed a handful of snow and wiped his face to wake himself up. Immortal Master, what are you going to do? He asked. I'm going out for a walk. Do you want to follow me? Bufang glanced at Wushuang. Wushuang was stunned. If you want to follow me, just follow me, Bufang said. After that, he pushed open the fence of the hut. Wushuang followed him out. Bufang locked the fence, grabbed his bamboo stick, stepped on the snow, and left quietly. Carrying a bag, Xiao Bai followed Bufang step by step. 80 poked its little head out of Bufang's arms. Without hesitation, Wushuang grabbed his sword and followed. The three figures slowly disappeared into the snowy depths of the mountains. Planet Immortality was not big, but it would take countless years to travel on foot. Bufang, Xiao Bai, and Wushuang, who had been following them. The three of them strolled across the planet. Starting from the mountains, they set out for the rest of the world. Wushuang was like a personal guard, guarding Bufang and helping him with many things. Bufang did not refuse and acquiesced to his behavior. Time passed, and 10 years flew by. Bufang's face had become much more resolute, and his eyes were filled with vicissitudes of life. Wushuang was dressed in shabby clothes, carrying a sword that had not been drawn for 10 years, and his face was covered with an unshaven beard. Xiao Bai, on the other hand, had not changed much. His iron skin was turned outward, and his mechanical eyes were still dim. 80 was still small and cute. Even when walking on foot, the little thing was still chubby. 50 years. The three of them continued walking. Wushuang had begun to show signs of old age. His back was stooped, and the veins on his arms were bulging. But he did not complain. He still followed Bufang and traveled the continent with Bufang. During the days he spent with Bufang, Wushuang had eaten delicious food and experienced an unprecedented change in his state of mind. In the past, he was called the #1 sword god of the empire. But when the empire fell, the sword god died. The so-called sword god had long since disappeared from the continent. But to be called the sword god, there were at least tens of thousands of people who had died under his sword. However, following Bufang made him feel as if he had experienced a soul baptism. Although he had not drawn his sword for decades, his understanding of the sword path had deepened a lot. The 100th year. The continent was almost at its end. They had left their traces in the polar regions of planet immortality, the endless forests, and the boundless sea. Wushuang's hair had turned white, and he had aged a lot. His blood and energy were beginning to dry up. The magnificent sword god of a generation was indeed old. Bufang's appearance did not change much. But in the depths of his eyes one could see the old will. After all, his body might not deteriorate after 100 years, but his soul could not bear it. Now, his soul was that of a mortal. Bufang had become more and more reserved. Xiao Bai and 80's appearance had not changed. The 200th year. Wushuang could not walk anymore. He had once stood at the peak, but he had not found the immortal path, so he was still a mortal. Bufang was also old. His hair was white and his face was wrinkled. He was a stooped old man. They did not continue to walk the continent because they had already visited all the places they could go. The world was big, and they had already seen it all. Therefore, Bufang did not continue to walk. In the past 200 years, they had seen the rise and fall of dynasties. When they were tired of walking, they should take a rest. In the downtown area, Bufang and Wushuang bought a house and lived here in seclusion. Bufang returned to his old business and opened a restaurant. However, he opened it casually. He only cooked according to his mood. Wushuang did odd jobs in the restaurant, and his sword had long been sealed away by him. He did not know whether Bufang was an immortal master. But would an immortal master grow old like a mortal? It was meaningless to care about this. He just wanted to live a quiet life now. He had tempered his heart in the mortal world. The current sword god had a stronger sword intent than he had in his heyday. The 300th year. Wushuang's life came to an end. He could not walk anymore, and he could no longer be a waiter. Bufang was also old, and he stayed quietly in the restaurant. The downtown area changed again, and so did the neighbors. The end of life was always calm and elegant. In the restaurant, Bufang poured a glass of wine and toasted Wushuang, who was sitting cross-legged across from him. The latter's breath was weak. He stared at Bufang with his cloudy eyes, full of complicated emotions. Xiao Bai and 80 were both in the restaurant. The atmosphere was a little heavy. After a long time, he sighed leisurely. "Immortal master, I'll take my leave first." The corners of Wushuang's wrinkled mouth twitched slightly. Bufang drank the wine in his glass. Boom! A wisp of extremely sharp sword intent swept away the vanity and soared into the sky. It soared into the sky. Terrible sword energy bloomed in the sky. This was the sword intent that had been condensed for 300 years. As soon as the sword intent appeared, the world was shocked. It was as if the legendary sword god had returned to the earth. In the restaurant, after Wushuang unleashed the sword strike, Wushuang's eyes widened. He lowered his head in satisfaction. His hands fell weakly to his waist. Bufang held the glass, and the wine in it rippled. After a long time, he sighed quietly. Time passed in a flash. In the void, Lord Bird appeared with his hands clasped behind his back. Outside planet immortality, one figure after another came over from the void. The looks in their eyes were very complicated. Their auras were extremely powerful, and they were all the top experts of the primitive universe. On this day, the top experts of the primitive universe arrived on planet immortality one after another. The whole planet was boiling. Chapter 1814. When the vanity was gone, all that was left was loneliness. Bufang sat upright in the restaurant. It was very quiet and peaceful. The wine swirled in the cup, rippling and spreading out in circles. Wushuang's head was bowed and his vitality was gone. He was a sword god and a cultivator. But on planet immortality, those who did not become immortals would always be mortals, and their lives would come to an end one day. Now, after following Bufang for 300 years, his life had come to an end. The last wisp of wick had run out. It turned into a dazzling sword intent and bloomed in the void. Wushuang's thinking was simple. Even if he was going to die, he wanted to leave one last breathtaking scene in this world. And he did. His sword shook the whole planet immortality. Countless experts exclaimed in admiration. Many peak experts of the martial way felt their hair stand on end. From this sword, they felt the invincibility and loneliness of tearing the void apart. This sword was not weaker than the sword of an immortal. However, this stunning sword strike was just the beginning. Everyone on the planet raised their heads and looked up at the starry sky. They were shocked to find, outside the starry sky, meteors fell one after another. A vast meteor shower shocked the world. Everyone thought that this was just a meteor shower, but they were wrong. The flames dissipated. What was revealed was the silhouettes of people walking in the air. Immortals! The whole planet was boiling. Everyone knelt on the ground. Countless experts of the martial way roared with desire. Planet immortality had always been searching for immortals. However, they had not seen immortals for tens of thousands of years, but today they saw the legendary immortals. One immortal after another descended. Countless people were excited. They kowtowed and knelt, praying to heaven. Hoda looked at the mortals below with a complicated look in her eyes. This planet was too backward. The concentration of spiritual energy here was not even 1% of that in the primitive universe. Is that man hiding here? Hotu sighed. It had been more than 300 years since that war. That man had disappeared for more than 300 years. Although the universe had been peaceful for more than 300 years. However, under this calmness, there was a turbulent undercurrent that was even more unbearable. At that time, everyone thought that the end of the world was coming. After all, the Supreme Soul God, who was comparable to the primordial heavenly Tao, had descended. However, no one had expected this. The mighty Soul God was suppressed and sealed by that man. He had sealed Soul God at the cost of his cultivation base. Below, countless mortals were kneeling in worship. Hodu could feel the surging spiritual consciousness. That was the faith of mortals. Hodu sighed. Why was Bufang hiding on this star? Just because this star is backward. Could it be that he wanted to quietly die of old age on this star? The mortals on this planet were constantly seeking immortality. But little did they know that a real big shot was hiding among them. To become an immortal in the mortal world. Perhaps that man was the only one who could do it. Hotu fell. Her body changed, becoming simple and unadorned. No mortals recognized her. There was a flash of light. Yang Jian appeared in plain clothes. The celestial dog followed him. Hodu and Yang Jian nodded, then turned their heads at the same time to look in the direction of the restaurant. In the restaurant they sensed a familiar aura. It was Bufang's aura. However, this aura was extremely weak, extremely weak. It was as if it would disappear at any moment. Bufang, Hotu and Yang Jian sighed. The celestial dog let out a low whine. The three of them stepped into the restaurant. It was very leisurely, and there was a calming aura in it. Mortal herbs were planted in the restaurant, and a faint fragrance wafted in the air. Xiao Bai's dull mechanical eyes turned and rested on Hotu and Yang Jian, who had just stepped into the restaurant. Then, it stopped paying attention to them. 80 lay weakly on the ground. When it saw the others step into the restaurant, it turned its head slightly. The little fellow's mood was very depressed. Outside the door, more and more immortals and deities of the primordial universe had arrived. To them, 300 years was just a blink of an eye. The name of Bufang still resounded like thunder in their ears. The title of the god of cooking, who had suppressed Soul God, made them want to travel thousands of miles to this planet. They just wanted to see Bufang's face. Hutu saw Bufang. She sucked in a cold breath. She covered her mouth with her hand, and her eyes were filled with disbelief. Bufang's current appearance, his white hair fell over his head, and he was wrapped in a shabby robe. His face was full of wrinkles, and his paralyzed face could be vaguely seen. However, it had lost a lot of its sharpness and gained a lot of stability. How did Bufang become so old? Yang Jian's expression was complicated. 300 years was the limit for a mortal. If it weren't for Bufang's extraordinary fleshly body, he would have died when he was 200 years old. However, although Bufang had become immortal, he could not have become so old. As long as he cultivated a little, with his previous foundation, it would not be a problem for him to become an immortal king and obtain immortality. Could it be that Bufang had given up on cultivating? When the celestial dog saw Bufang, it scurried over and licked Bufang's face. There was a flicker of emotion in its eyes. Bufang rubbed the dog's head. When he looked at it, he could not help but think of Lord Go. For Lord Go and you, perhaps 300 years was just a blink of an eye. But for Bufang it was almost a lifetime. Different horizons led to different sensitivity to time. If he were an immortal, he would not care about 300 years. But for a mortal, 300 years was already 3 lifetimes. Hutu opened her mouth, wanting to say something. However, Bufang raised his withered hand and waved it. Say no more, do me a favor. Bufang raised his head and looked at Hutu with his cloudy eyes. Hutu paused. Bufang pointed at Wushuang in the distance, who had his head bowed and said, "This boy has been with me for 300 years. If it were 100 years ago, he would have had a chance to become an immortal by cutting the void with his sword. Unfortunately, he gave up that chance and continued to follow me. Now I want you to help me save him." Yang Jian and Hutu's eyes rested on Wushuang. The look in their eyes changed slightly. Although Wushuang had withered and died, the sword intent he left behind was extremely terrifying. Can a mortal achieve such a terrifying sword intent? Sure enough, those who could follow Bufang were not ordinary. Hutu nodded. With Bufang's identity, this was not too much to ask for. The lives on planet Immortality were also in the primitive transmigration, so Hutu could naturally save him. She raised her hand and circulated her energy. She tapped her finger lightly in the void, as if she was picking a leaf. Wushuang had just died. His soul had not yet dissipated. Under the guidance of Hutu's energy, it quickly condensed. Although Wushuang was a sword god in their eyes, he was no different from a mortal. Yang Jian raised his hand. He flicked his finger. Suddenly, a stream of energy flowed out and fell on Wushuang. His old body began to recover at a speed visible to the naked eye. Soon, he returned to his youthful and vigorous state. It was as if time had been turned back 300 years. Of course, Yang Jian's method was not to turn back time, but to help him recover his qi and blood and let his body bloom with vitality again. Buzz, his soul returned to his body, and his qi and blood rumbled. Soon, Wushuang opened his eyes. He gasped for breath, and his forehead was covered with beads of sweat. Is he dead? No, he's not dead. He's alive again? How could he be alive again? His life force had come to an end, and he could see the river of transmigration. How could he be alive again? Wushuang looked at his body, which was full of vitality, and he sucked in a cold breath. Wushuang opened his mouth. He saw Hutu and Yang Jian. He turned his head and saw Bufang sitting cross-legged in the distance. Could it be that Bufang saved him? Did the immortal master finally make a move? Owner Bu, let's go back and cultivate again. When Soul God appears, I'll need you to suppress him. Hutu looked at Bufang with eager eyes. Saving Wushuang was just a matter of convenience. However, the most important thing was to let Bufang return to the primitive universe. Yang Jian did not say anything. His eyes were filled with anticipation as he looked at Bufang. The celestial dog stuck out its tongue and licked Bufang's face. Everyone was waiting patiently. In midair, Lord Bird's body was shrouded in mist. Looking at Bufang, he sighed. His figure disappeared into the void once again. He had witnessed Bufang's transformation over the past 300 years. It was a transformation in the deepest part of his soul. He had witnessed Bufang's cooking skills improving day by day. He had never thought that, at Bufang's level, his cooking skills could still improve at such a speed. Every dish he cooked contained the purest and most genuine emotion. Lord Bird was filled with emotion. Back in the ancient heaven god's relic, he had discussed cooking with Bufang. At that time, Bufang insisted that the quality of the ingredients determined the quality of the food. At that time, Lord Bird used a jar of heaven god husband and wife wine to refute Bufang. But he had never expected that hundreds of years had passed. Bufang had given up the path he had always insisted on and embarked on the emotional cooking path. Just like the heaven god husband and wife wine, every dish was filled with emotion. But the emotional path was even more difficult. It was almost impossible to reach the end. Some emotions might have to be witnessed by life and death. 300 years. Lord Bird hid in the void for 300 years and had been guarding Bufang. Bufang traveled the stars and comprehended the emotional path. From the feelings he had for the village at the beginning to the feelings he had seen when he traveled the continent. He was used to seeing all kinds of emotions in the mortal world. From the perspective of a bystander, he included all the emotions on this planet. Today, Bufang had cast aside the vanity and dregs, and what was left was the essence. Unfortunately, the emotional path was not that simple after all. Bufang shook his head, picked up the cup, and drank the wine in one gulp. He turned his head to look at Wushuang. Now that you have become an immortal, do you want to stay or leave? The path to becoming an immortal is open to you, Bufang said. His eyes were calm. That calmness made Hutu and Yang Jian's hearts palpitate. Wushuang was still a little confused. He needed to sort out his thoughts. He has become an immortal? He thought. The surging magic power in his body made his face flush. He had followed Bufang for 300 years, and the sword intent he had comprehended could already shatter the void. Although his comprehension was not as profound as Bufang's, Bufang had occasionally answered his questions. His sword was not the emotionless sword, but the emotional sword that had fused with his own emotions. Immortal Master, I swear to follow you until death. Wushuang knelt on the ground and stared at Bufang with some emotion. Bufang nodded. He did not say anything. He asked Hutu and Yang Jian to leave. Go. I will return when I have to. If I can't, everything will have to go with the rules. The stately painting can only suppress Soul God for 1,000 years. If I can't return and force my way back, I won't be able to stop Soul God from breaking the seal. It's meaningless, Bufang said. I've repaid my debt. Now what I have to do is walk the path I should walk. Bufang's words made Yang Jian, Hutu, and the others frown. They could not guess what Bufang was thinking. But they could do nothing about Bufang's stubbornness. They left the restaurant. The other immortals and deities kept coming in to visit Bufang. They were really annoyed. Bufang asked Xiaobai, who had been silent for a long time, to make a move. After exposing a few immortals and deities, these curious little immortals and deities finally calmed down. Wushuang was horrified. It turned out that the dull, iron-like Xiaobai was so strong. The immortals stayed outside the restaurant. Time flew. Another 200 years passed in a flash. Chapter 1815. Planet immortality had become extremely popular. With the arrival of many immortals, the planet, which was so small that it was not even noticed in the primitive universe, suddenly became popular. The increase in the number of experts also sped up the pace of the planet's development. The spiritual energy of heaven and earth became denser day by day, which was influenced by the strength of many almighty experts. As immortals, it was not difficult for their auras to affect the development of a planet. Because of the increase in the number of immortals, it was impossible for immortals to cultivate on a planet lacking in spirit chi for 200 years. Therefore, they found something interesting to do to pass the time in their boredom. If they did not cultivate, a few hundred years was really a long time. Immortals established sects, schools, and all kinds of powers. Planet immortality, which was originally dominated by mortals, suddenly became dominated by immortals. Some immortals even joined the establishment and replacement of mortal dynasties out of interest. The feeling of being in charge amused many immortals. Of course, immortals who could be so bored basically did not have very high cultivation bases. For example, immortal kings, immortal emperors, and saints of the Great Path. They all walked the world like mortals. The Great Path was the simplest. Sometimes it was like this. More and more immortals gathered around Bu Fang's restaurant. The restaurant became very popular. However, no matter how popular it was, the management of the business followed Bu Fang's heart. If he closed the restaurant, even if the immortals knelt and begged him, it would be useless. Although Bu Fang was only a mortal now, and the dishes he cooked were only ordinary dishes that did not contain any spiritual energy, the immortals all ate them with relish. Yang Jian and the celestial dog seemed to have settled down around Bu Fang's restaurant. Every day, after eating in Bu Fang's restaurant, he would take the dog for a stroll. Yang Jian and the celestial emperor seemed to have settled down around Bu Fang's restaurant. He and the celestial emperor resigned from the important task of guarding the celestial court and came to the restaurant. He had been living there for 200 years. Erlang Shen seemed to have comprehended something after the 200 years of bustling days were swept away. In the past, he was as bright as the brightest star, about to tear heaven and earth apart. He was a genius of the celestial court, and his cultivation base was extremely high. A three-pointed, double-edged saber struck fear into the hearts of countless immortals and mortals. However, after 200 years of settling down and staying with Bu Fang, Yang Jian's murderous nature was restrained. Every move he made was like a mortal. The celestial hound might have forgotten that it was a divine hound. Tian ate and slept, slept and ate. His body was so fat that it was as if he had been punched. It no longer had the bravery of the number one divine dog of the immortal court. However, the celestial hound was happy to do so. After all, not everyone could eat cooking god Bu's dishes every day. In the restaurant, smoke curled up from the chimney. Bu Fang sat quietly on the futon in the restaurant. There was a small tree planted in the restaurant. This small tree was found in a rugged land when he was traveling across the stars. It was a lifeless zone filled with jagged rock. There were rocky mountains everywhere. The weather was hot during the day and cold at night. Even Bu Fang felt uncomfortable in that kind of place. However, this small tree grew with great difficulty between the two rugged rocks. Its roots climbed on the rocks, and its roots were almost dried up. It was on the verge of death. If it hadn't met Bu Fang, no matter how unyielding it was against fate, it wouldn't have been able to resist the mighty power of nature. At that time, Bu Fang was deeply moved. The greatness of life impacted him. Therefore, he took the small tree away. If he didn't, the strong sapling would be completely extinct soon. Now, this sapling was growing in Bu Fang's restaurant. Its branches were luxuriant, and as they swayed, there seemed to be a supreme Tao connotation. This sapling had been with Bu Fang for hundreds of years, and it had been permeated with Bu Fang's Tao. Swish! Bu Fang, who was sitting there, opened his eyes. He got up, his back hunched. Even if it was this physical body, after 200 years, his life force had been completely depleted. When one was old, there were many things to think about. That was what Bufang was thinking now. Sometimes, he doubted whether the path he was taking was the right one. Everyone would be afraid of death, especially this kind of slow and unending death of old age. The fear of waiting for life to come to an end was like an endless nightmare that would devour everything in a person. Bufang stood up and lowered his back. His movement made Wushuang, who was sitting cross-legged in the restaurant, open his eyes. Elder Bu. Wushuang came over and supported Bufang. Are you going to open today? But your health. Wushuang looked worriedly at Bufang. 80 lay on Xiao Bai's head, looking listless. Bufang waved his hand and opened his eyes slightly. It's fine. Open for business, Bufang said. After that, he walked slowly toward the kitchen. Wushuang sighed. He was now known as Sword Immortal Dugu. It seemed that under the influence of Bufang, his cultivation base had skyrocketed, and he was now only one step away from the Immortal King realm. His sword could cut through the heavens, and its power was terrifying. Even Yang Jian had praised his swordsmanship. In the past 200 years, Wushuang had only drawn his sword once. That time, it was a reckless heaven immortal who wanted Bufang to cook. Even after being rejected by Bufang, he still refused to give up. Wushuang did not say anything. He drew his sword. Even if he killed a heaven immortal, his sword would not be stained with blood, and the heaven immortal's soul would be shattered. After that time, the whole planet Immortality knew how terrifying Sword Immortal Dugu was, so no one dared to disturb him. Bufang also had a lot of peace and quiet. Although in the past, Bufang had shaken the universe and suppressed Soul God, Bufang was just a mortal now. However, he was just a mortal now. Many immortals and deities who walked the unconventional path even wanted to get the legacy from him and a higher-level cultivation technique. Of course, these immortals and deities were all fools. Those with low cultivation bases. The truly powerful immortals and deities knew very well how terrifying Bufang was. Not only Bufang, but also Xiao Bai, whose iron skin had turned upside down and whose body was rusty. That was right. Xiao Bai was rusty. As Bufang grew old, Xiao Bai seemed to decay with him. Its iron skin was covered with rust. The rust made Whitey look like it had aged and deteriorated a lot. It had not eaten for several years. It might have sensed something. It was listless. Every day, it just lay on Xiao Bai's head and stared blankly at the restaurant. Wushuang sighed. He walked to the entrance, opened the old wooden door, and pushed open the wooden shelves one by one. The restaurant's door opened. In an instant, it attracted the attention of countless immortals and deities. Outside, streams of light shot out as immortals turned into beams of light and flew over. They were all competing with each other in speed. They were afraid that if they fell behind, they would not be able to eat anything. Many immortals now pursued Bufang's food not for cultivation base. Instead, it was for cultivation base. Over the past 200 years, several immortals had eaten Bufang's food. Their Dao accumulations had improved, and they broke through realms with a thought. There were even immortals who became immortal kings with a thought. This made the restaurant's reputation more and more popular, so countless immortals from all over the primitive universe rushed to this remote and distant restaurant. Line up in order. Today, only 10 diners will be served. Wushuang stood at the door, his eyes downcast, and said indifferently. He had not drawn his sword for 200 years, but his aura had become more and more terrifying. The immortals landed. They quieted down and lined up in an orderly manner. Yang Jian stepped into the restaurant with the celestial dog. Wushuang nodded at Yang Jian. Wushuang, your state of mind is still too sharp. You need to be more mellow so that you can be stronger. Too rigid is easy to break, Yang Jian said with a smile. Wushuang cupped his fist respectfully. Yang Jian sat in the restaurant and waited quietly. He was the first customer every day, and it had been like this for 200 years. If he wanted to be the first customer, who would dare to refuse? Naturally, the immortals did not dare to refuse. A delicious aroma wafted out of the kitchen. Wu Shuang's cold and sharp eyes glanced at the immortals below. 500 years ago, he was very respectful to immortals because he wanted to become an immortal. But after following Bufang for 500 years, the so-called immortals were nothing more than that. They were just people who had a hard life on the road to immortality. A clanking sound came from the kitchen. Wu Shuang hurried into the kitchen. He came out with a steaming dish and placed it in front of Yang Jian. The celestial dog jumped up and landed on the table. "Oh, it's fried rice today." Yang Jian narrowed his eyes and chuckled. He grabbed the spoon, said nothing, and began to eat. It was not egg-fried rice, but fried rice. There was something extraordinary in the simple fried rice. There were many kinds of ingredients, but no matter how rich they were, they could not hide the essence of the rice. Nowadays, the diners would not ask for anything to eat. They went into the restaurant. They ate whatever Bufang cooked. It was the same for Yang Jian. When the fried rice entered his mouth, the aroma of the rice and the other ingredients made him feel as if he had experienced the vanity of the world. Yang Jian closed his eyes and ate quietly. After eating for a long time, he could not help but sigh. Bufang's cooking skills were getting better and better. In the past, Bufang's food could only amaze people and arouse their appetite. But now, no matter how simple Bufang's dish was, it could make one's soul palpitate with just one bite. Was this progress? But the price of this progress, could he really accept it? Yang Jian opened his eyes, which were full of confusion. The ruthless path and the emotional path. In the battle back then, Soul God's shocking words and the silence of the primitive great path had, in fact, shocked the souls of many primitive immortals and deities. To set foot on the supreme peak of the universe, one must sever the 7 emotions, 6 desires, and be emotionless and thoughtless? Soul God and the soul overlords of the 7 great sins had sacrificed themselves without hesitation. Even Soul, who loved him to the extreme, had abandoned him without any reluctance. It was like the primitive great path. Even when the primitive world encountered a crisis of destruction, it remained indifferent. Was this really what a Tao seeker wanted? He ate a mouthful of fried rice. It was a simple dish, but it made Yang Jian's state of mind fluctuate. Tens of thousands of miles away from planet immortality, a stream of light flew past. A giant python crossed the planet. The next moment it turned into a green light and turned into a lively young girl. A minotaur landed next to the girl. They landed on a dead planet. They looked into the distance at the blue planet immortality. "We're finally here." The girl's voice was like pearls falling onto a jade plate. The minotaur's eyes shone brightly. "Owner Bu, you want to leave me behind, but I won't let you." Nyo Hansan took out a spirit fruit and crunched it into pieces. Hua glanced at Nyo Hansan, then her eyes fell on planet immortality again. She gritted her teeth. After hundreds of years of seclusion, she had reached the peak of the 7-colored sky-devouring python. With Nyo Hansen's help, she had even completed a breakthrough evolution. Her current cultivation base was already different from before. However, when she came out of seclusion, everything had changed. The familiar aura on planet immortality made her eyes flicker slightly, and her heart, which had long been calm and tranquil, fluctuated. "Let's go," Hua said. Nyo Hansen nodded. A beam of green light flew past. Hua turned into a green python again, flew across the sky, and landed on planet immortality. Nyo Hansan seemed to finally be able to find Bufang. He was very excited. Rumble. The two flew toward planet immortality's atmosphere. Yang Jian, who was eating in the restaurant, opened his eyes slightly. He frowned. A 7-colored sky-devouring python that has cultivated to the peak? What a strong aura! The immortals and deities on planet immortality were also shocked, and they all raised their head. In the sky, the terrifying giant python fell, shocking heaven and earth. Ah! Owner Boo, your Nyo Han-san is back. Nyo Hansen's laughter spread over the whole planet. Ting-a-ling! The curtain of the kitchen was lifted. Bufang slowly walked out of the kitchen with a hunched back. He slowly wiped the water stains on his hands with a wet cloth. Well, it's almost time for my old friend to come. Bufang's eyes were calm. However, amidst the calmness, there was a surging intent. Wushuang paused. His eyes turned red. Chapter 1816. Nyo Han-san and Hua arrived. Many experts on planet immortality were shocked and seething with excitement. However, that was all. After all, many big shots had descended on planet immortality over the past 200 years. Therefore, they did not pay too much attention to it. Hua and Nyo Han-san sensed the aura of the restaurant. He headed straight for the restaurant. When they landed outside the restaurant, many immortals looked at them. These immortals didn't recognize Hua and Nyo Han-san, but their powerful auras put them on high alert. The two of them walked straight into the restaurant. However, Wushuang stopped him. "We want to see Owner Boo," Hua said. After a few hundred years, she had grown into a slender and elegant woman. She had grown even more mature and beautiful. Her every frown and smile seemed to radiate beauty. This was the charming aura emitted by the seven-colored sky-devouring python, which had reached the great success stage. Wushuang's eyes were cold and unmoved. Nyo Han-san came up to Wushuang and said with a smile, "Little brother, you look like a new waiter hired by Owner Boo, right? Let us in. We are old acquaintances of Owner Boo, line up," Wushuang said lightly. He glanced at the two of them. Nyo Han-san was stunned. This brother was so stubborn. The surrounding immortals looked like they were watching a good show. Hua frowned and looked into the restaurant. But before she could open her mouth to call out, Bufang's indifferent voice came from within. "Wushuang, let them in." Wushuang was stunned. Then, he nodded. He turned his body slightly and said, "Please." Nyo Han-san narrowed his eyes, took out a spirit fruit, and threw it to Wushuang. "Little brother, that's right. Here, I'll give you a spirit fruit," Nyo Han-san said with a smile. Wushuang took it with a cold face. The rich spiritual energy in the fruit made his pupils constrict. Nyo Han-san grinned. This was his hybrid spirit fruit, and it was definitely an extraordinary fruit. He wouldn't even give it to ordinary people. The moment he stepped into the restaurant, the familiar atmosphere made Nyo Han-san take a deep breath in comfort. Yang Jian glanced at them indifferently and did not say anything. Bufang sat on a cushion under a tree, holding a cup of hot tea in his hands as he watched Nyo Han-san and Hua enter the restaurant. The moment Nyo Han-san saw Bufang, he was stunned. What happened? How did the once high-spirited Bufang become so old and frail? With Bufang's strength, how could he become so old? Was he, Nyo Han-san, hallucinating? "Owner Boo," Nyo Han-san said anxiously, but Bufang waved his hand and interrupted him. Hua pursed his lips, a complicated look in his eyes. He couldn't believe that Bufang had become like this. There was no aura of spiritual energy in him. He had become a mortal. That powerful man had actually been reduced to such a state. Nyo Han-san fell silent. Ever since the farmland was separated from Bufang and he wandered in the universe, he knew that something bad must have happened to Bufang. He didn't expect that the once powerful Owner Boo would become a mortal. Moreover, judging from Owner Boo's aura, he seemed to be at the end of his rope. Damn it! Nyo Han-san began to rummage through his dimensional bag. He took out one spirit fruit after another and threw them away. He was a little disappointed. He found that the spirit fruits he had hybridized could do nothing about Bufang's current situation. "There's no need to look. This is the path I chose," Bufang said. Nyo Han-san stopped what he was doing. Nyo Han-san immediately flew to Bufang's side and cried for his parent. "Owner Boo, if you die of old age, how can I live? I'm so sad. No one will talk to me about hybridization in the future. It's so hard. Bufang. Hua. Alright, get up. Bufang glanced at Nyo Han-san. The latter got up with tears and snot on his face. Hua walked over and looked at Bufang with a complicated gaze. You're out of seclusion? You came just in time. I have something for you to bring out. Bufang said. Hua was stunned. I thought I wouldn't be able to wait for you. Bufang's lips twitched, and the wrinkles on his face trembled. He shook his head. Why are you like this? You can stand at the top of the universe. Hua said. Aren't I also standing at the top of the universe now? Bufang gave Flowery a playful look, causing the latter to be slightly taken aback. He walked his own path, and in the end, he walked out of his own world. Perhaps he was already above the universe. It was a mysterious feeling. Man is small, but also great, Bufang said lightly. Wait for me. Bufang turned and went into the kitchen. Everyone was stunned. Is Bufang going to cook? Wu Shuang sighed. This was the first time he had seen Bufang like this. Was that moment really coming? Wu Shuang's heart tightened. He found it hard to accept. He had learned about Bufang's deeds from many immortals. The latter was a real big shot in the universe. He was a terrifying existence who could destroy planet immortality with a single thought. But now, he was like an old man, as if he was handing over his funeral affairs. For some reason, he felt a little sad. The sound of cooking came from the kitchen. It was not loud, but it made many people's hearts heavier. The aroma of food spread out and lingered in the air. Hua sat in a chair and waited quietly. Nyo Han-san lay on the table, tears streaming down his face. He had finished eating and did not plan to leave. He felt that something big was going to happen today. So he decided to wait. The immortals around him were silent, staring at the restaurant. It seemed that something extraordinary was about to happen. Wu Shuang sat cross-legged with his sword on his back, his eyes red. Sizzle, the restaurant was very quiet. There was only the sound of Bufang cooking and Nyo Han-san sobbing. At this moment, Hua wanted to slap Nyo Han-san. Can't you be serious? Time ticked by. Finally, the sound of cooking in the kitchen stopped, and it became quiet. Everyone held their breath. In the kitchen, Bufang's back was stooped. He walked slowly out of the kitchen, step by step. In his hand was a rosewood lunchbox. He came to the restaurant. He placed the lunchbox on the table. Bufang took a deep breath. Everyone's eyes fell on the lunchbox, and their eyes froze. The looks in Hua and Nyo Hansen's eyes were very complicated. Bufang opened the lunchbox. Then, he took out one steaming dish after another. This is dragon blood rice. Bring it to Void City for you. She should be able to eat it on the day she comes out of seclusion. Bufang brought out the sparkling dragon blood rice. Although he had lost his cultivation base, he could still cook spiritual energy dishes with his cooking skills. Hua nodded. Bufang continued. This is sweet and sour ribs. Help me give it to the Lord Go, who oversees the chaos space. He should have lost a lot of weight after not having sweet and sour ribs for a long time. The corners of Bufang's mouth lifted slightly. There's also Ha's spicy strips. It must be hard for him to live without them. Here's a meatball, an ordinary meatball. I don't think little who will mind. Xiaopi, help me give this jar of wine to him. Bufang brought out one dish after another. Hua's eyes grew more and more stunned. These were all familiar dishes, but why did Bufang bring them out at this moment? I don't want them. Give them to them yourself. Hua frowned, shook his head, and refused. Bufang gave Hua a look. Stop it. These words made Xiao Hua's body stiffen. After a long time, he sighed. His hand shook. A light flashed, and all the dishes were taken away. Remember, if they don't have enough to eat, I'll come to you again, Hua said to Bufang seriously as he walked out of the restaurant. The corners of Bufang's mouth lifted slightly, and he nodded. Nyo Han-san sniffled. Owner Bu, where's this old cow? Nyo Han-san said. Bufang glanced at Nyo Han-san. He raised his hand. He waved at 80, who was lying listlessly on Xiao Bai's head. 80's eyes lit up. With a leap, it appeared beside Bufang. Bufang rubbed 80's head. Help me take care of 80. He's the best ingredient in the world. 80's body stiffened and its chicken butt twisted. He's not the best ingredient. He's just a chicken. Nyo Han-san squeezed 80's neck and kept nodding. This old cow will be the most powerful father of hybrids in the world. Leave 80 to me. Don't worry. Nyo Han-san made a solemn vow. Bufang raised his eyebrows. He hesitated. Why did he feel uncertain about what Nyo Han-san said? However, Bufang did not say anything in the end. Bufang turned his head and looked at Wushuang in the distance. Wushuang walked over. Elder Bu, it's time for you to go out and explore the world. You don't have to guard me anymore. The world is big, and your sword can be stronger. Bufang said. As long as you stick to the sword path in your heart, sooner or later, you will reach the height I once reached. Wushuang's eyes reddened slightly. He nodded solemnly. All right. In the distance, Yang Jian let out a sigh. He could see that Bufang's aura of life began to dissipate like running water. After all, Bufang was once a chaotic saint. He had transcended the primitive universe and was no longer bound by this universe. Therefore, his aura of life had dissipated, and he did not enter the transmigration. Bufang raised his head. His eyes were indifferent. From today on, the restaurant will be closed. Everyone disperse, Bufang said. As soon as his voice rang out, everyone's heart trembled. In the distance, the rusty whitey stood up with its iron skin flipped over. There seemed to be a flash of light in his mechanical eyes. Then, under everyone's incredulous gaze, a rumble rang out. Bufang and Xiao Bai also disappeared. Buzz, 10,000 flowers bloom with a single thought. Bufang's faint sigh lingered in the restaurant. On that sturdy little tree, beautiful flowers suddenly bloomed one after another. In the restaurant, all of a sudden, the restaurant was filled with dazzling light. The flowers spread and covered everything. Holy flowers bloomed under everyone's feet. With the restaurant as the center, they spread in all directions. Chapter 1817. 1 flower, 2 flowers, 10,000 flowers bloomed with a single thought. With the restaurant as the center, they spread out in all directions of the city. The jade-green vines spread out and intertwined, forming flower buds. The flower buds vibrated quietly and bloomed quietly. A fragrance wafted through the air, looking extremely beautiful. In an instant, the flowers spread across the entire city. The immortals fell silent. Nyo Han-san held 80 in his arms, his eyes filled with tears. Owner Bu, how could such an awesome man become like this? Hua carried the sandalwood lunchbox, his eyes flickering slightly. Yang Jian sighed and stood up. His body suddenly changed. He put on his armor and held his three-pointed, double-edged saber. The celestial hound's body emanated black smoke as it followed behind him. It's time to go back, Yang Jian said. The next moment, he turned into a stream of light, stepped on an auspicious cloud, and soared into the sky. The immortals were shocked. The mortals were even more shocked. They had never seen such a scene before. Even the emperor and his ministers in the palace were alarmed, and a look of disbelief appeared on their faces. The mortals knelt and kept kowtowing, praying for peace. One day they saw 100 flowers bloom. This auspicious sign caused them to be extremely excited. They believed that if they prayed now, their wish would come true. Wushuang did not leave. He leaned against the wall of the restaurant, slowly slid down, and sat on the ground. He sighed. He raised his hand and covered his face. He had thrown the sword to the ground. He was a little confused now. Bufang asked him to leave the restaurant and travel the world. Perhaps after traveling, his strength could achieve a breakthrough. But Wushuang did not. He stayed in the restaurant and sat quietly. Niu Hansan held 80 in his arms and did not leave. Like Wu Shuang, he also stayed in the restaurant. The old bull still believed that owner Bu would come back. Niu Hansan clearly remembered that he was captured by Bu Fang and brought into the heaven and earth farmland. He thought he was going to die. However, it was good that he was dead. His days in the ruined prison were not good. However, in the heaven and earth farmland, he didn't expect that his days would get better and better. He even realized the value of his life and was filled with positive thoughts about his future. He learned how to hybridize and displayed his usefulness, becoming the father of hybridization in the other world. He still remembered that he and Bu Fang were discussing how to make perishing pot, how to infuse the will of the great path into ingredients. When he thought about it, it felt like a lifetime had passed. Little Eighth was also listless and had no appetite to eat. Hua left. She had to do what she had to do. She had promised Bu Fang, so she naturally had to fulfill it. Niu Hansan did not go with her. Hua didn't insist. Thus, she turned into a giant python and streaked across the sky. She held the lunchbox in her mouth, and there seemed to be a strange energy circulating within the lunchbox. In fact, the food in the lunchbox was only made from ordinary ingredient. Chaotic universe. Hangu Pass. The 4 experts sitting cross-legged on Hangu Pass slowly opened their eyes. There was a complicated look in Tongtian's eyes. He raised his hand. Sword light swirled around him. With his hands clasped behind his back, he stood on the city wall and looked at a dish hovering in the distant sky. It was like the most stunning dish in the world, blooming with supreme brilliance. It attracted everyone's attention. With just a glance, it made people unable to restrain their appetites. They couldn't wait to taste it. However, no one dared to try it. It was a simple dish, but it contained an incomparably terrifying existence. All kinds of arrays had been set up around it. These were the top arrays of the chaotic universe, and each of them possessed terrible lethality. They were all there to prevent the terrifying existence suppressed by the dish from coming out. 500 years. It's gone in a flash. Tongtian heaved a sigh. He didn't expect 500 years to pass so quickly. The arrays Bu Fang had set up could only suppress Soul God for 1,000 years, and now half of the time had passed. It was as if an hourglass was constantly flowing. All that was flowing was time. Tongtian's eyes were deep. He took a step forward. In the next moment, his figure suddenly disappeared from this world. A sword light streaked across the boundless universe. It shot toward planet Immortality. On planet Immortality, Tongtian, dressed in a Taoist robe and carrying the Qingping sword on his back, walked slowly. In the distance was a restaurant. Flowers were blooming around the restaurant. Tongtian's pupils constricted. Those flowers were the condensation of will, and they contained energy that made his heart palpitate. He walked between the flowers and came to the restaurant. 2 people and a chicken were sitting in front of the door. Niu Hansen's face was covered with snot and tears, and he cried bitterly. Tongtian glanced at him indifferently. Then, his eyes fell on Wu Shuang. Tongtian's pupils constricted. He looked at Wu Shuang as if he was looking at a sharp sword that was about to be unsheathed. A genius of the sword path had a far better understanding of sword intent than a so-called sword immortal. If he was given enough time to grow, he could even reach the level of a chaotic saint. That was rare. Wu Shuang glanced at Tongtian. There was sadness in his eyes. Tongtian did not say anything. He just shook his head. Although he wanted to take Wu Shuang as his disciple, he saw a trace of despair in Wu Shuang's eyes. He knew that if he proposed to take Wu Shuang as his disciple, he would definitely be rejected. Sect leader Tongtian's divine sense instantly covered the entire planet Immortality. After a long time, he sighed. I'm too late after all. Did he really become a decaying mortal and disappear from this world? Failed in seeking the Tao? Has he come to the end of his life? Tongtian's eyes were complicated. He took a step forward. In an instant, He turned into a sword and shot into the sky. On planet Immortality, the deep mountains were covered with snow. On the mountain road that was covered with a thick layer of snow, two figures were walking with difficulty. Bufang walked step by step with his back hunched, leaving footprints in the snow. However, these footprints were soon covered by the wind and snow and disappeared. Xiao Bai followed closely behind him. In the distance, a small cottage appeared. Xiao Bai's mechanical eyes flashed. Bufang came to the front of the wooden cottage, gently pushed it open, and shook off the crisp snow. It was a familiar place. Bufang was back here. He pushed the door open and took out a bamboo chair. Unfortunately, the chair was rotten, and the cottage was about to collapse. The decaying wooden cottage was like Bufang, which was about to decay. Instead of sitting on the chair, Bufang sat on the stairs in front of the cottage. He sat quietly. Xiao Bai also sat beside him. The atmosphere was very quiet. There was no sound. The leaves rustled. It was as quiet as a silent game. He had chosen to live in seclusion here and live a simple and unrestrained life. But now he came back here and sat down again. Xiao Bai sat quietly. He was rusty and decayed, similar to Bufang. Bufang's eyes flickered. He lowered his head, and all the sounds became very clear. The sound of insects, the sound of melting snow, the sound of blowing wind, the sound of children playing in the newborn village at the foot of the mountain, the sound of fish swimming in the frozen river in the mountain stream. Bufang suddenly came to his senses. He turned his head quietly and looked at Xiao Bai beside him. Xiao Bai's body emitted bits of baiguang. Those baiguang were constantly dissipating, dispersing in the air, drifting in the void. Xiao Bai's mechanical eyes looked at Bufang. It stretched out its hand and patted Bufang's shoulder. Then, his body began to turn into baiguang and constantly dissipated. Ring, 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 the sound of wind chimes swaying rang out. Bufang was stunned, watching Xiao Bai turn into baiguang and rush into the sky. It seemed to turn into sand between fingers and quietly slip away. The feeling of loss made him inexplicably uncomfortable. Bufang raised his hand. He looked at his fingers. His fingertips were also emitting bits of baiguang, like Xiao Bai. These white light spots were like the teleportation array that the system built for Bufang when it first appeared. Bufang raised his head and looked at the sky. The white light spots that his body had turned into drifted into the sky. Ring, 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 the sound of wind chimes rang out. There was nothing in front of the decaying wooden hut. Boom, snowflakes flew. The wooden hut roared. The decaying wooden hut fell to the ground and completely turned into ruins. Under the cover of the wind and snow, they became the dust of history. Bufang and Xiao Bai this time really disappeared. In the mist, Bufang opened his eyes. Was he dead? He glanced at his body. His old body was gone. He became slender and thin again, just like when he had just inherited the system. Bufang was slightly stunned. He did not want to walk the ruthless path, not because of anything else, but because he was a chef. If he was ruthless, what delicious dishes could he cook? Dishes without emotions were all hooligans. He did not deny that the ruthless path existed because it had its own reason. The primordial heavenly path was the ruthless path. If heaven had feelings, it would also grow old. It was precisely because it was ruthless that it could exist forever. Bufang looked around. It was extremely dark. It was a kind of cold darkness, as if the soul was imprisoned and could not break free. Xiao Bai was not there, and there was no acquaintance around. A surging sense of loneliness made Bufang feel lonely. Looking back, he had been a mortal for 500 years. He had experienced the coldness and warmth of human feelings in the world. The lifespan of a mortal was limited. Because of his physical body, it was not easy for him to live for 500 years. But in 500 years, he had seen through the decay and reincarnation of life. Kinship, friendship, love, brotherhood, master and disciple. He had experienced all kinds of emotions. Of course, these emotions were felt from mortals. For him, it was shocking. Buzz Bufang was thinking in a daze. In the boundless darkness, perhaps only these emotions in his memory could bring a little warmth to his body. Suddenly Bufang was stunned and looked at the boundless darkness. Bit by bit, Baiguang gathered together. It transformed into a human figure. That figure was extremely blurry. However, it gave Bufang an extremely familiar feeling. That familiarity went deep into his bones and spread into his soul. His face was blurry and he could not see clearly. His slender figure and fluttering black hair. He was wearing a simple white robe. He condensed from white light spots and floated in front of Bufang. Huh? Bufang was stunned. He stared at that figure. The blurry figure slowly floated. After a while, it floated in front of Bufang. The blurry face moved closer and almost touched Bufang's face. Bufang could even feel that the other party was smiling. "Who are you?" Bufang asked expressionlessly. A voice that seemed to be produced by the vibration of the soul resounded in Bufang's mind. However, that voice made Bufang's body suddenly tense. "Host of hundreds of generations? You are finally here, after hundreds of generations. You are the only one who insisted on coming here." "Who am I?" "I am here to help you take the last step." God. Chapter 1818. God. Bufang paused. The one who could be called a god in front of him should be the legendary god of cooking. The creator of the system, the one who had helped Bufang embark on the path of the god of cooking. The one who stood high above the masses and seemed to control everything. The god of cooking set, the god of cooking's menu, the god of cooking system. From the beginning, Bufang's everything was related to this god of cooking. In the beginning, Bufang had worked hard to become the god of cooking. However, at some point, Bufang began to walk his own path. The so-called path of the god of cooking in his heart was no longer the god of cooking that had been hanging over his head, but the path he wanted to walk now. Even if the path was full of thorns and bumps, yes. The god who will help you take the last step. The blurry figure seemed to be laughing. It made Bufang very uncomfortable. Bufang did not know why he was here. Where was this place? The transmigration space? But it should not be. Bufang had long jumped out of the shackles of heaven and earth, and was no longer in the transmigration. The figure's white robe fluttered. Although his face could not be seen, however, Bufang was very calm. Perhaps his 500 years of mortal experience had made it difficult for his state of mind to fluctuate. "You don't seem very surprised?" the vague figure said. There was some doubt in his words. "Why should I be surprised? I knew you would come sooner or later," Bufang said lightly. He and the vague figure floated in the air, facing each other. Bufang's black hair fluttered, as if he was at the bottom of a bottomless pool. "The host of 500 generations. You are the only one who can come this far. Aren't you proud?" the vague figure said. "With my help, you will soon touch the realm of the real god of cooking. You will become a supreme existence." The vague figure smiled. His voice was very soft. It made people feel like they were bathing in a spring breeze. Bufang didn't say anything and just looked at the figure indifferently. In fact, there were a few hosts who could have reached this step before, but they all refused. The blurry figure said with some regret. He raised his hand as if to caress Bufang's face. However, when his hand touched Bufang's face, it turned into white spots of light and dispersed. The blurry figure did not seem to mind. "Now, are you ready?" Bufang shook his head. He looked at the figure indifferently. "Actually, if possible, I don't want to go this far." Bufang shook his head. The blurry figure was slightly taken aback. "Why? Why?" The corner of Bufang's mouth twitched slightly, revealing a hint of mockery. He raised his hand and pointed at the pitch-black space around him. "What do you think?" The blurry man burst into laughter. "Don't worry. After accepting everything I give you, You will be able to return and stand at the highest point in the world, overlooking all living things. You will rule the world. The blurry figure raised his arms and said domineeringly, I'm just a chef. How can I rule the world? Bufang shook his head and said indifferently. The blurry figure was speechless. If you continue like this, there's no way we can continue this conversation. Bufang was very calm. He clasped his hands behind his back and looked around. Where's Xiaobai? Can he still return? Bufang asked. Xiaobai? You mean the chef puppet? That's just a dead thing. He has protected you to this level, which means he has completed his mission. He can be considered to have completed his mission and can disappear in peace. Everything in the world, everyone and everything has their own reason and meaning of existence, the blurry figure said. There was a hint of indifference in the blurry figure's words. Bufang froze in midair at this kind of indifference. Bufang stared at the blurry figure. What are you talking about? Bufang said. Xiaobai is my friend. What right does he have to disappear? Bufang's voice was filled with violent emotions. Your emotions are too strong. You shouldn't be like this. Soon, you will be a supreme existence. You will look down on all living things in the world. You have to look at them with the mentality of all living beings. You should be like an ancient well without ripples. You should not carry any emotions. You don't need to worry about anything. The blurry figure said. All right, don't say those useless words. Are you ready to accept the real inheritance? As long as you accept it, you will be the supreme existence in the world, the blurry figure said patiently. Bufang frowned and stared at the blurry figure. God of cooking? Is this guy really the god of cooking? I don't accept it. Bufang shook his head and refused the temptation of the guy in front of him. In other words, the current Bufang was completely indifferent to this temptation. Unless his heart accepted it, he would not be swayed at all. You don't accept it? Why don't you accept it? You started out as a nobody, and everything you've been pursuing is to become the god of cooking. Now, this opportunity is right in front of you. Why don't you cherish it? The blurry figure said calmly. The latter's words seemed to become colder and colder. This is not the path I chose. Bufang said. You are only one step away from what you yearn for. What are you hesitating for? What are you wavering about? The god of cooking? Or those insignificant people? The blurry figure said, his white robe fluttering faster and faster, You should choose me. I'm the one who has supported you all the way to this point. I'm your future. The blurry figure almost roared. That voice made Bufang's eyes slightly shrink. After a long time, the dark space suddenly quieted down. Bufang looked at the blurry figure. Are you done? The blurry figure was taken aback. What the hell are you talking about? Bufang shook his head, a little disappointed. You're not the god of cooking. If you are, how could you say such a thing? Bufang said lightly. The blurry figure hovered in the darkness. White spots of light kept hovering. How could I not be the god of cooking? I know everything about you, and I've seen everything about you. The blurry figure said. He raised his hand. Instantly, drops of divine power liquid drops emerged in his palm. Bufang was very familiar with those golden divine power liquid drop. See this? I once gave you this divine power liquid drop, the blurry figure said. The humanoid figure said. His tone seemed to be a little hurried. Bufang's eyes became more and more playful. The wind was blowing fiercely. The hasty, blurry figure quickly regained his composure. I said, I refuse. Bufang's face was expressionless. His words were resolute and decisive. Finally, the blurry silhouette floated up. A burst of laughter rang out in the dark space. It was very loud. Soon, the dark space began to shake. Rumble. The sound of something collapsing rang out. The darkness began to disappear, and a white light emerged in front of Bufang. The white light grew brighter and brighter, and eventually, it completely blinded his eyes. Congratulations! You've resisted the temptation. There are no shortcuts in this world, even if you're only one step away from the peak. From the moment you set foot on the path of the god of cooking, you're destined to be extraordinary. This is the last test I'll give you. I wish you good luck. The blurry figure disappeared. Only the rumbling of heaven and earth was left. The next moment, Bufang gradually became familiar with the light. It was very soft. In front of him appeared a cabin in the woods. The wind was blowing gently, very soft and very comfortable. Bufang clasped his hands behind his back and looked around. Slowly, he walked toward the cabin. He pushed the door open. Inside the cabin, a strong aroma wafted out. On the table was a dish that had been stripped of its ostentatiousness, emitting countless rays of golden light. The radiance was dazzling and eye-catching. Bufang sat in front of the table. Looking at the dish, he took a deep breath. The aroma went into his mouth and nose, making Bufang feel as if his whole body had been baptized. It was a simple dish, but in its simplicity, there was something extraordinary. The light flowing over the dish made Bufang take a deep breath. With Bufang's eyesight, he could tell at a glance that the quality of these ingredients was absolutely extraordinary. Each of them was the essence of heaven and earth. The top ingredient, a dish cooked with such ingredients, stripped of its ostentatiousness, contained its essence, which was extremely terrifying. Was this the god of cooking's last test? Bufang took a deep breath. Then, he sat in front of the dining table. He turned his head and looked around the room. There was only a dining table and a stove in the room. It was very simple. Bufang seemed to think of something. The corner of his mouth twitched. He withdrew his gaze and rested it on the dish in front of him. He raised his hand and grabbed the chopstick. The chopsticks fell and picked up the delicacy in the dish. When Bufang took a sniff of the ostentatious dish, he felt as if his soul had been sublimated. He slowly put the dish into his mouth. He chewed it. Bufang's pupils constricted slightly. So delicious, Bufang's eyes flickered. He felt a little incredulous. Did such a delicacy really exist in the world? Bufang felt as if he was galloping in the universe at this moment. He was shuttling between countless planets, feeling the baptism of the purest aura of heaven and earth. At this moment, he felt a sense of pride, as if he was looking down on all the other mountains. A god of cooking dish. Bufang was sure that this dish must have been cooked by the god of cooking. After eating this dish, he felt that his aura began to soar, rising rapidly from the realm of a mortal. His aura rumbled. Soon, he broke through the level of a saint of the great path. With this one thought, it was as if he had thrown everything to the back of his mind. Bufang closed his eyes. He let out a long breath. He raised his hand and felt the surging magic power in his body. He shook his head. This is the first time I've eaten a god of cooking dish. It's really incredible. This was not a pseudo-god of cooking dish, but a real god of cooking dish. It was even more powerful than the mountain and river map that Bufang used to suppress Soul God. Bufang's eyes were filled with complicated emotions. Such a dish. But I don't feel any emotional fluctuation. God of cooking, is this the path you chose? Bufang shook his head and sighed regretfully. No. Bufang's regretful expression suddenly froze, and he slowly opened his eyes. He picked up another dish with his chopsticks and stuffed it into his mouth. The room became very quiet. There was only the rustling of the wind outside the hut in the forest. Bufang closed his eyes. This time, it tasted completely different. He closed his eyes. A beautiful figure seemed to emerge in his mind. Her voice and smile appeared. Although he did not know her, he could feel the joy in her smile. This dish was not only ruthless. It was also the path of emotion. Bufang opened his eyes, and a tear fell from the corner of his eye. However, this path of emotion was bitter. There was a trace of emotion in its ruthlessness. Was this the god of cooking's path? Bufang put down his chopsticks. He seemed to hear a low moan. It was as if someone was whispering something into his ear. She was telling a story in a low voice. The story made Bufang's eyes grow sadder and sadder. After a long time, Bufang sighed. There was a trace of emotion in the path of ruthlessness. This was what the god of cooking wanted to express, and what he wanted to express was obvious. This path would not work, because the god of cooking was walking toward death on this path. The god of cooking's final test was obvious. He asked Bufang to cook a dish, and this dish it had to surpass the god of cooking. Otherwise, Bufang would fail the test. And the price of failure, it was obliteration. Whether it was the system or the god of cooking, they had set the tone from the beginning. Bufang did not flinch, nor was he afraid. He stood up. With his hands clasped behind his back, he walked step by step toward the kitchen of the hut in the forest. Swish, pulling out the kitchen knife, the corners of Bufang's mouth lifted slightly. Chapter 1819. The hut in the forest looked shabby, but since it was the place where the god of cooking prepared for Bufang's final test, many things were extraordinary. Bufang held the kitchen knife in his hand, and he seemed to be able to feel the extremely terrifying fluctuations contained within it. It was much more powerful than the dragon bone kitchen knife in its full form. The kitchen knife, the wok, the stove, everything was of very high quality, like a top divine artifact in the universe. The god of cooking was also very concerned about this final test. He hoped that Bufang could cook a top delicacy, because only then could he be truly qualified to inherit the god of cooking's inheritance. Therefore, the ingredients and cooking utensils the god of cooking prepared for Bufang were all the best in the world. Holding the kitchen knife, Bufang's face gradually became expressionless. His eyes were somewhat deep, as if he was thinking about something. After a long time, Bufang shook his head and put down the kitchen knife. He didn't use the cooking utensils the god of cooking prepared for him. He looked at the ingredients piled up in the distance, which exuded a round aura. They were all top ingredients in the universe. They were not weaker than great soul overlords. Using the best ingredients and cooking utensils to cook the best delicacies, the corner of Bufang's mouth twitched. He took a step back. Sitting cross-legged on the ground, he didn't start cooking. Instead, he fell into deep thought. The god of cooking's dishes were a mixture of the ruthless path and the emotional path, with the ruthless path taking up more of it. Perhaps it was because of this that the god of cooking began to pursue a successor. The god of cooking had taken the wrong path, and he might have perished in the universe. That was why he was looking for 100 hosts. Bufang pondered for a long time. He looked indifferently at everything in front of him. Then, the gorgeous cooking utensils and ingredients began to change. The originally flashy and surging top-grade ingredients became very ordinary. The originally surging top-grade ingredients also became very mediocre. Just like the ordinary cooking utensils used by the villagers in the countryside. From the world's top cooking utensils and ingredients, they became the most common mortal ingredients and cooking utensils in the world. Perhaps even the god of cooking did not understand what Bufang wanted to do at this moment. Bufang stood up, holding the ordinary kitchen knife in his hand. He took his time and started cooking, using these simple ingredients to cook. A fresh cabbage was washed clean by Bufang. He slowly peeled the cabbage, as if pouring all his emotions into it. He cracked the egg into the bowl and slowly cracked the egg with his chopstick. He watched as the egg white and the egg yolk mixed together. The reddened pork was placed on the chopping board. Bufang did not use his exquisite knife skills. Instead, he used his hands, which were covered with water droplets, to hold the pork down and slice by slice. Slowly cut it into pieces. Everything was done in an unhurried manner. Bufang was not as impatient as he used to be when cooking. It was this kind of ordinary knife skills that could bring out the taste of the ingredients to the extreme. This was a kind of knife skill that poured emotion into it. As the knife sliced down, the concern for the ingredients spread out. Bam! The shining white flour was poured out, and the flying dust drifted, making Bufang's hands white. Bufang's hands were clear, slender, and white. He piled the flour into a small bag. He poked a small hole in the middle of the flour. When the shining white water was poured into the hole, the flour immediately collapsed and began to float. The water surged, breaking the flour like water bursting a dam. It kept flowing, but halfway through, it was all absorbed by the flour, rolling into a ball of flour. Bufang's hands fell. Those water balls were instantly crushed, and the flour was kneaded together. Not too fast or too slow, he kneaded rhythmically. He did not use the Tai Chi kneading method. He did not use the power of the law or the great path. Bufang kneaded the dough at a leisurely pace. It was as if he was rubbing and bathing his child. In the sky, there seemed to be a pair of invisible eyes watching Bufang. Perhaps it was because he was amazed by Bufang's cooking method. He had top-grade ingredients and powerful cooking utensils, but he did not use them. He was cooking in the most ordinary way. Did Bufang think that cooking in an ordinary way could be compared to cooking with the best ingredients and cooking utensils? Bufang was unmoved. His eyes were full of emotions. The flour was gradually kneaded into a ball. As he pressed his hand down slightly, the porcelain basin made a soft noise. What was a real god of cooking dish? Bufang used to think that with top-grade ingredients and cooking utensils, he could cook the best delicacies. But that time, he was wrong. Perhaps it was because he was not strong enough. With Xiaopi's help, he could only cook a pseudo-god of cooking dish. The gap between them was like a universe light years, and it could not be bridged. Bufang had spent 500 years thinking and chasing after that one-step gap, but he still could not surpass it by even a little bit. Bufang knew that kind of despair very well. And when he ate the god of cooking's dish, it was a dish cooked with top-grade ingredients and top-grade cooking utensils. It was a god of cooking dish cooked with the best of the right time, place, and people. There was no hypocrisy. However, it did not amaze Bufang. It even made him feel a little lost. Could it be that a real god of cooking dish could only reach this level? Bufang began to question it. He began to reflect. He felt that maybe his method was wrong. Putting aside the vanity, he cooked with the most ordinary ingredients and the simplest cooking utensils. He kneaded the dough into small balls. Using a rolling pin, he carefully rolled the small balls into pieces of dough wrapper. On the other side, in an ordinary clay basin, Bufang mixed all kinds of ingredients together and stirred them. The ingredients were mixed together. It was a kind of miraculous chemical reaction which amazed people. Bufang was intoxicated. Simplicity was the real deal. This might be the god of cooking dish that Bufang was pursuing. He quietly scooped out a spoonful of stuffing and stuffed it into the dough. Bufang carefully wrapped the dough, layer by layer. He was very serious. While wrapping the dumplings, Bufang's eyes wandered. In his chaotic eyes, 500 years of time appeared in front of him bit by bit. For Bufang, 500 years was the time he had spent most of his life. Even on Earth, in the hidden dragon continent, in the Heaven Chief realm, in the chaotic universe, the time spent was not as long as 500 years. For Bufang, these 500 years were a kind of mental stability. Sometimes he missed his old friends, and sometimes he missed the positive mood and mentality when he first stepped into cooking. At that time, he was small and fearless, but it was this kind of fearlessness that made him feel a little amused. There were more and more dumplings on the stove, and soon, they were piled up. Bufang stopped. There was no more dumpling skin, and the stuffing was finished. However, he felt that only a moment had passed. Bufang raised his hand and rubbed his nose. A pinkish-white spot appeared on his nose. After wrapping the dumplings, he spread the white gauze underneath and put the dumplings into it one by one. Bufang covered it with a steamer. Behind the stove, there was a large pile of firewood that had just been burned. It was like the firewood that Bufang burned alone in the deep mountains. He put the firewood into the stove. He lit the fire. Boom! The fire suddenly rose to the sky. It was a simple fire. It was not flashy, and it did not spread any energy. The fire was burning. He blew into the stove, and black smoke spread, choking Bufang and making him cough a few times. The fire was also lit. There were 2 pots on the stove, both ordinary pot. One was steaming dumplings, and the other was cooking other food. Sizzle! The oil was poured into the pot and began to splash. Bufang poured the processed ingredients into the pot. Sizzle! Sizzle! White steam rose. It was the steam produced by the explosion of the oil. He held an ordinary ladle and began to stir-fry. The ingredients began to turn golden, and the fragrance flowed out like gurgling water. He shook the pot and stir-fried the ingredients in the pot. Then, he scooped out the steaming dish. The rich fragrance refreshed one's mind. Bufang took a deep breath. He felt that his heart was about to melt. He had been cooking for so many years, and this was the first time that a dish made him so intoxicated. Swish! He put strips of noodles into the pot. The noodles began to soften, rolling in the boiling water. The strips of noodles were very thin. This kind of noodles was the dragon whisker noodles that Bufang used to cook. Dragon whisker noodles were also called longevity noodles. Bufang felt an inexplicable desire to cook them at this moment. In a blue and white porcelain bowl, Bufang poured the sauce, vinegar, soy sauce, chopped green onions, and other seasonings into it. When the dragon whisker noodles were boiling, he scooped out the boiling dragon whisker noodles from the pot and put them into the bowl. Bufang's eyes were a little complicated. He seemed to remember when he was a child, the dragon whisker noodles his parents cooked for him on his birthday. There was no birthday cake, only a bowl of dragon whisker noodles. It was a simple bowl of noodles, but it contained his parents' care for him and their wish for him to grow up healthily. He exhaled. Bufang's hand was slightly trembling as he scooped up the noodles. Gulp, gulp. The dumplings in the steamer were cooked. Bufang took the steamer out of the pot. He placed it on the stove. White steam kept rising from the steamer. Bufang opened the lid of the steamer. White steam rolled out like a dragon. White and tender dumplings, emitting steam, were placed in the steamer. Bufang picked up the dumplings one by one and arranged them like a blooming flower. In the center of the flower was the sauce he had prepared. In this way, his dishes were cooked. A bowl of steamed dumplings, a bowl of longevity noodles, a fried egg, and a small stir-fried meat. 4 dishes, simple and easy. Bufang took out a blue and white porcelain bowl and scooped up a bowl of sparkling, fragrant white rice. At this point, his dishes were completely cooked. There were no gorgeous ingredients, no earth-shattering cooking utensils. It was a simple and ordinary dish, but it contained Bufang's 500 years of experience and emotions. It was ordinary but extraordinary. This was the choice Bufang made in the last test of the god of cooking. In the cabin in the woods, Bufang took out the dishes, placing them on the table. On the table were the dishes cooked by the god of cooking, shining brilliantly and dazzlingly. When Bufang placed the dishes on the table, the radiant dishes suddenly dimmed. "My cooking is over. Please have a taste." Bufang placed the rice on the table, setting up a spoon and chopstick. His voice lingered in the cabin, so confident and loud. The last test. A plate of side dishes, a plate of steamed dumplings, a bowl of dragon whisker noodles, and a fried egg. A bowl of white rice. That was all. Chapter 1820. It was a simple table of dishes. They were ordinary, but there was something extraordinary about them. They could actually suppress the god of cooking's dishes on the table, and they didn't look dim at all. That was a god of cooking's dish, cooked with the world's top ingredients and the most precious kitchen utensils. Compared to ordinary dishes, it was like heaven and earth. Bufang raised his hand and made a gesture of invitation. Then, in the void, specks of white light began to rapidly gather. Soon, a human figure was formed. The figure landed on the table and sat on a chair. The figure was very vague, exactly the same as the one Bufang had seen in the dark. It was the god of cooking. The god of cooking didn't speak. He was only in charge of the assessment this time, so he didn't say anything. Bufang also pulled out a chair, sat down, and watched indifferently. He didn't care about this assessment that concerned life and death. He wasn't even nervous at all. There was only calmness in his heart. It was a wonderful feeling. After all, this was the last round of assessment. But he was calmer than the first assessment. Perhaps this was the transformation of his mentality. The god of cooking picked up his chopsticks. His head was foggy, and his face couldn't be seen clearly. His chopsticks fell and picked up a steamed dumpling. The steamed dumpling emitted steam, and the skin of the dumpling was crystal clear. Under the light, the dumpling filling was reflected. It was a very ordinary dumpling. From the outside, there was nothing special about it. The god of cooking opened his mouth and took a bite of the dumpling. As he bit down, the heat slid out like silk and spread into the air. The dumpling filling tasted delicious. The fresh cabbage was full of water, and the meat filling was also chewy. But these were not the most important things. After the god of cooking took a bite of the dumpling, his body suddenly froze. After a long time, then, he sighed leisurely. The dumpling was dipped in the sauce. When it entered his mouth, it was even more fragrant. A plate of dumplings, 9 dumplings, the god of cooking ate them all one bite at a time. An ordinary dish actually made him unable to control his hand and completely stuffed it into his mouth. This feeling, how many years had it been since he had felt it? After eating the dumplings, the god of cooking's eyes fell on the dragon whisker noodles. On the surface of the dragon whisker noodles, there was a cute fried egg. When he uncovered the omelette, a piping hot aroma immediately gushed out. The soup of the dragon whisker noodles was extremely clear. Chi-Chi, the god of cooking, took a sip of the soup. What entered his mouth was a strange taste. It didn't have any amazing texture, and the ingredients were simple and ordinary. But when they fused together, it gave birth to an indescribable feeling. This kind of feeling made his heart feel like it was melting. Bufang sat on the chair and watched quietly. He did not interrupt the god of cooking's taste. After taking a deep sip of the soup, the god of cooking exhaled. How much exhaustion and how much nostalgia was contained in this breath! Bufang's expression changed slightly. The god of cooking was also a man with a story. The soft texture of the dragon whisker noodles made the god of cooking nod repeatedly. He buried his head and ate the noodles and eggs quietly. Only the sound of slurping could be heard. Suddenly, Bufang was stunned, because he saw drops of golden crystal tears dripping from the god of cooking's misty head. With a splash, it fell into the soup of the dragon whisker noodles, causing circles of ripples to form in the soup. Bufang pursed his lips and did not say anything. Perhaps the god of cooking had already felt it. The god of cooking raised his hand and held his forehead. He sighed as he ate the noodles. That posture was helpless and sad. Although he was the god of cooking, a supreme existence, the feeling he gave Bufang was that he was a mortal, a simple person. The dragon whisker noodles were also finished. There was no soup left, only a chopped green onion stuck in the bowl. The god of cooking gently put down the bowl. He picked up the white rice. He took a bite of the rice. The round rice grain had a fresh rice fragrance. When it entered his mouth and chewed, it even gave off a sweet taste. He picked up a piece of stir-fried pork, which was stir-fried with thinly and evenly sliced pork. When the piece of meat entered his mouth, the god of cooking's hand holding the chopsticks seemed to tremble. Every dish contained emotions, which were the crystallization of 500 years of Bufang's mortal life. All kinds of emotions were integrated into it. Such a dish might be more attractive than a simple delicacy cooked with top-grade ingredients. The rice was finished, and the stir-fried pork was finished. The 4 simple dishes were all eaten up. However, The god of cooking's dish on the table only had a dim light left. It was no longer so dazzling. The god of cooking leaned back in his chair. Bufang did not speak, just looked at him quietly. Bufang did not know the result of this last test. The god of cooking did not know what he was thinking. The feeling the god of cooking gave Bufang was that he was like an ordinary person, full of flesh and blood. The latter looked at the sky. Bufang could feel a blurry gaze coming from it, looking at the sky. There was a story behind that gaze. After a long time, the god of cooking raised his hand and swept it. The god of cooking's dish on the table disappeared. "It's really a perfect table of dishes," the god of cooking said. His voice seemed to have become very hoarse at this moment. "Dishes with emotions are indeed very attractive, but this path is very difficult to walk." The god of cooking's eyes finally fell on Bufang. Bufang nodded. "If heaven has emotions, it will grow old. If one pursues the path of emotion, he will age with time. After 500 years, I have seen through it. It's like a rule that cannot be broken." The god of cooking stood up and put his hands behind his back. "I just want to ask you one last time. Are you really going to walk this path?" Bufang also stood up and put his hands behind his back. The two of them stood in front of the hut in the forest and looked at the boundless wilderness. "I can't be ruthless. There's no way back." There was a long silence. The god of cooking smiled. "Congratulations, you've passed the final test. Your dishes are very charming, and the emotions contained in them are moving. In the past, I didn't understand this feeling. I thought that only by being ruthless could I be eternal, but I couldn't be truly ruthless. I provoked the world of mortals and eventually perished in the starry sky. I hope you won't follow in my footsteps. Perhaps you don't need my inheritance anymore. But I have to tell you that the path of emotion is not so easy to walk, so I'll give you a way out." The god of cooking said. Buzz, everything in the hut in the forest began to change. The environment was collapsing. Then everything around them turned as dark as ink. It was so dark that one couldn't even see their own fingers. Bufang watched in a daze. He knew that everything just now was not real, but that feeling was so real. He was indeed the god of cooking, a supreme existence. Buzz, a spot of light flickered. Baiguang was dazzling, like a star blooming in the night sky. The next moment, Baiguang became brighter and brighter, and a holy lotus emerged in front of Bufang. "This is the senseless lotus. If you want to take a step back, you can eat it. It can make you forget all your emotions." The god of cooking's voice became distant. Then, a golden book slowly emerged. Bufang recognized it. It was the god of cooking's menu. However, unlike the previous incomplete god of cooking's menu, this one was complete. It exuded the supreme aura of the great path, which shocked Bufang so much that his heart beat wildly. Was this the god of cooking's inheritance? The god of cooking's menu. This is the last inheritance, the inheritance of the god of cooking's menu. However, the menu follows the ruthless path. If you really inherit it, you must erase all your emotions and forget them. Otherwise, your soul will be torn to pieces by the power in the god of cooking's menu. The god of cooking's voice was very distant. Bufang focused his eyes. Sure enough, the god of cooking walked the ruthless path. Although there was a wisp of emotion in it, it was still ruthless in nature. Therefore, if he wanted to inherit the god of cooking's inheritance, he had to choose ruthlessness. Bufang hesitated. He had been pursuing the path of the god of cooking for so long, and now he was almost at the end. He was just one step away. The end of the ruthless path was the god of cooking's menu. As long as he chose to accept it, he would become the new god of cooking. On the other hand, he had walked out of the emotional path. However, the emotional path was full of fog and had too many unknowns. On one side was the path of the predecessors, and on the other was his own path. Which should he choose? It was really a difficult choice. How should he choose? Bufang hesitated and pondered. A senseless lotus bloomed quietly in the darkness. Its beauty was beyond compare. With just a glance, one felt as if one's mind would be completely sucked away. Mu Hongzhi had once said that the senseless lotus could help him ward off a disaster. Was that what he was talking about? If he chose the path of the god of cooking, he would not be destroyed, which could be considered as blocking a disaster. However, if he chose the emotional path, he was very likely to die of old age on the path. Even at the end of his life, he would not be able to find the true emotional path of the god of cooking. The senseless lotus was so white that it could make people forget all their troubles. It was as holy as the purest thing in the world. Eating the senseless lotus could cut off the 7 emotions and 6 desires. It would save him a lot of hard cultivation. How should he choose? Bufang did not make a decision immediately. Instead, he sat cross-legged. The god of cooking gradually turned into Baiguang and dissipated. He disappeared between heaven and earth. Bufang looked at the senseless lotus and the god of cooking's menu in front of him. He sat in silence. After a long time, Bufang looked up. His eyes gradually became firm and determined. Finally, he raised his hand. A ball of divine flame emerged. The flame floated and enveloped the senseless lotus and the god of cooking's menu. The scorching flame rolled and burned the senseless lotus and the god of cooking's menu into nothingness. I, Bufang, don't need a way out. Ha 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 ha. The god of cooking's laughter lingered between heaven and earth. There was a hint of loneliness in his laughter. 100 generations of hosts, but in the end, he got a host who pursued the emotional path. Perhaps all of this was the true fate of the world. I hope you won't regret the choice you made today. The god of cooking said. Since you've chosen the emotional path, I'll give you a hand. I hope you can really set foot on the highest peak. The god of cooking laughed. White spots of light slowly emerged and kept spreading toward Bufang. Like a hazy mist, they wrapped Bufang's body. Bufang stood quietly where he was. The corner of his mouth twitched slightly. The highest? Perhaps there is no highest in the culinary path, only higher. Boom! More and more white spots of light appeared. Finally, Bufang's eyes were filled with countless white baiguang. He opened his eyes hazily, and his eyelashes fluttered. White snowflakes fell from the sky and landed on his face. A cold feeling seeped into his skin. He's alive? Chapter 1821. Snowflakes drifted in the air. His heart was lonely. Bufang opened his eyes and looked at the blue sky, slightly dazed. It was like a dream. What he had just experienced made him feel very complicated when he thought about it now. He sat up. A cold feeling came from his body. Bufang looked at his naked body and frowned. Snowflakes fell quietly from the sky and fell on his body. They were melted by his body temperature, turned into snow, and flowed down. Xiao Chen rubbed his hair, and his long and narrow hair spread out, brushing past his body, giving him a ticklish feeling. Standing up, Bufang glanced around. The heavy snow had sealed the mountain. The place where he was now should be deep in the mountains of planet Immortality. He disappeared from this place and was reborn here. The gift that the god of cooking gave him was probably rebirth. However, Bufang was now a completely mortal. He had no cultivation base, and his fleshly body was no longer the extremely strong chaotic saint body he had before. Bufang sucked in a cold breath and shook his head. Why did he have to strip himself naked? Where did the god of cooking get his bad taste? Was he going to freeze to death as soon as he was reborn? Bufang exhaled a breath of hot air and left the depths of the mountain. His footprints gradually disappeared in the wind and snow. Then, he left the snowy mountains. Bufang was dressed in shabby linen clothes. Instead of looking for the original restaurant, he hid his identity and sneaked into the city. With his cooking skills, he opened a restaurant. He began to cultivate again. While cultivating, he cooked. Strictly speaking, he could be considered reincarnation. However, his cultivation talent was much stronger than before. Perhaps because he had comprehended the emotional path, Bufang's cultivation speed was very fast. In the chaotic universe, a giant python stretched across the sky. With a sweep of her serpent tail, a star was shattered by her tail. A beam of green light flashed, and Hua fell into the chaos space with the food box. Her eyes were red and sad. He pursed his lips, hugged the lunchbox tightly, and walked into the chaos. In the primal chaos, the 5 great heavenly deity palaces had all appeared. They stood in the primal chaos, forming a profound formation. The formation sealed off the world, forming a powerful defense. When Hua landed in the chaos, he naturally attracted the attention of the people in the chaos. Lord Go, Hades' era, and little Hu Xiaopi flew over and hovered in the void. Suddenly, he appeared in front of Hua. They were all old acquaintances, and as soon as they met, they did not say anything. Hua was silent. Her red eyes made Lord Go and Hades' era sigh. They seemed to have already known something. In the heavenly time temple, the 4 heavenly deities stood there. Lord Go stared at Hua. "Little guy, did Bufang send you here?" Lord Go asked. Hua nodded, exhaled, and placed the lunchbox in front of Lord Go. "Bufang, he asked me to bring these to you," Hua said. She opened the lunchbox. She took out a dish from it. It was an extremely ordinary dish that was giving off steam. "This is Lord Go's sweet and sour ribs. Bufang gave it to you." Hua handed the sweet and sour ribs to Lord Go on a blue and white porcelain plate. Lord Go was stunned. His paws trembled slightly as he held the plate. The sweet and sour ribs with the juice flowing down was reflected in Lord Go's eyes. Swish! Lord Go looked at the sweet and sour ribs, and inexplicably, Bufang's face and voice appeared in his mind. "Alas! Bufang!" Lord Go sighed. He and Xiao Bai had been Bufang's companions for the longest time. They had a tacit understanding of each other since Fang Fang's little store in the Light Wind Empire. Lord Go still remembered Bufang's appearance when he called him to eat sweet and sour ribs every day. The sweet and sour ribs in front of him didn't have any flashy energy, and it wasn't cooked with top-grade dragon meat. However, Lord Go felt depressed when he looked at it. He took a deep breath. Lord Go started to eat from the porcelain plate, just like how he ate happily in Fang Fang's little store in the Light Wind Empire. Bite by bite while eating, Lord Go sighed. "It's delicious. This is the best sweet and sour ribs Lord Go has ever eaten, the most delicious dish. Unfortunately, I'd rather not eat it," Lord Go murmured. As soon as he finished speaking, the aura on his body fluctuated. Boom! A terrifying aura soared into the sky, as if it could shatter heaven and earth. This kind of pressure made many experts in the primal chaos extremely shocked. Heaven God time had begun to break through? From a top chaotic saint to a perfected chaotic saint. A single dish had created a perfected chaotic saint in the temple of Heaven God life. Hades' era's face was haggard. He supported his chin with one hand, looking at a spicy strip on the table. It was an ordinary spicy strip. It didn't have any light or energy. However, it made Era's heart tremble. Spicy strip, spicy strip. Could this be the last spicy strip I, Nether King Erha, will ever eat? Bufang young man. Hades' Era's eyes were misty as he ran his fingers through his hair. His eyes were slightly red. He picked up the spicy strip, put it in his mouth, and sucked it in and out. His nose was sore. He took a bite of the spicy strip, covered his mouth, and his eyes were wet. "I can't eat Bufang young man's spicy strips anymore." Hades' Era was so sad that he could hardly breathe. He covered his face and sobbed. No one knew if he was really sad for the spicy strip or for Bufang. In the temple of Heaven God Destruction, Little Hu lay motionless on his back in the palace. Beside him was a meatball. In the temple of Heaven God Space, Xiaopi was lying in a jar of fine wine, bobbing up and down, his eyes rolling. He had really become a drunken shrimp. Hua looked at the chaos space, which was shrouded in sorrow. He sighed. Then, he turned into a giant python and flew across the starry sky. He went through the cosmic passage and came to the universe where Void City was. In the distance, Void City floated quietly in the universe, looking calm and peaceful. Hua went all the way in. In the sky above Void City, a graceful and luxurious noblewoman emerged. She opened the passage and welcomed Hua in. In front of the Queen of Curse's palace, Hua landed. Xiao Ai, Kersey, and the 4 dukes appeared, looking at Hua with complicated eyes. Hua was now Bufang's spokesperson, but their emotions were getting more and more complicated. "Where's Sister Nethery?" Hua asked. Xiao Ai pointed at the Queen of Curse's palace. "Sister Nethery, the dish Bufang asked me to bring you is here," Bufang said. Kersey shook her head. "It's useless. Nethery can't hear us. Leave the dish with me. I'll give it to her when she comes out of seclusion." However, Hua shook his head. He just stared at the closed door of the Queen of Curse's palace. He stared at it for 3 days and 3 nights. Just when Hua was about to leave in disappointment, rumble, the door of the Queen of Curse's palace opened a slit. A crystal clear and beautiful arm, which looked like the most perfect arm in the world, stretched out from behind the palace. "Give it to me." Yu's cold voice came from it. Hua's face lit up. With a shake of his hand, the bowl of fried rice flew out, landed on the perfect arm, and was put into the Queen of Curse's palace. Rumble, after a long time, a terrible aura burst out of the Queen of Curse's palace. Kersey sighed as she gazed at the tightly shut palace gates. "I really don't know if it's a blessing or a curse." Yu was at the critical moment of inheriting the Queen's legacy, but she was distracted and came out to get a takeaway. She wondered if it would cause the legacy to fail. The primitive universe. In Hangu Pass, which stood majestically in the starry sky. 4 top experts sat in the starry sky, suppressing terrible existences. Formation after formation lingered in the starry sky. Every star seemed to contain absolute killing intent. Tongtian's face was cold. The Immortal Slaying Sword Array and the 10,000 Immortal Array were set up. Yuanshi Tianzuan held the Pangu axe and created arrays. Goddess Nuwa sat in the starry sky, injecting the energy of the 7-colored divine stone into the arrays to maintain them. Bells rumbled. A Buddha kept chanting Buddhist scriptures. In the distance, a dish floated quietly in midair. Countless arrays were spreading around the dish. Suddenly, Tong Tian, who had his eyes closed, opened them, and they burst into a dazzling light. The pseudo-god of cooking dish, the stately painting, which was suppressing Soul God, was missing a piece. It was as if someone had swallowed a small piece of it. A chill instantly swept through Tongtian's body. "Damn it! That guy has begun to struggle." Yuanshi Tianzuan, Goddess Nuwa, and the Buddha all opened their eyes. On planet Immortality, in an ordinary city-state, a young man began to rise slowly. He kept a low profile, but no one dared to provoke him. In his first year in the city-state, the young man opened an ordinary restaurant, which was as crowded as a marketplace. In the second year, the restaurant had become the focus of the royal family. No one dared to cause trouble in the restaurant. In the third year, the city's strongest expert came to the restaurant to cause trouble, but the owner suppressed him with a wave of his hand. From then on, no one dared to provoke the restaurant. Even the royal family treated it with respect. Bufang was wearing a white robe. After closing the restaurant's door and hanging a closed sign on it, he went upstairs to sleep. However, he did not sleep. Instead, he sat quietly cross-legged and began his daily cultivation. As he breathed, the spiritual energy of heaven and earth was absorbed by Bufang like a whale. His body was shrouded in a faint light. In just 3 years, his cultivation base had risen rapidly. He had reached the level of an earth immortal, and he was only one step away from becoming a heaven immortal. In Bufang's opinion, all of this seemed reasonable. On planet Immortality, with the departure of Bufang and Xiao Bai, many immortals had left the planet. However, there were still quite a few immortal experts on this planet. However, these immortals could not sense Bufang's presence at all. He seemed to have jumped out of the world and was growing quietly. In the 5th year, Bufang often suspended business. He left the restaurant and walked in the starry sky. He would stop at dead planets and extract a bit of essence from them. In the 10th year, Bufang had no idea how long he had walked and how much essence he had extracted. In the 100th year, outside planet Immortality, a sword light tore through the sky and landed in the city. When it dissipated, a figure with sword-like eyebrows and starry eyes appeared. His aura was much more ethereal. Wushuang's eyes were calm, and his aura was extremely powerful. His sword intent seemed to be able to cut through the starry sky. Wushuang, a half-step saint, had calm eyes, as if he had seen through everything in the world. He had reached a bottleneck and returned to this planet because of nostalgia. He returned to the restaurant. The restaurant was gone. It was directly taken away by someone using a powerful technique, leaving only an empty ground. For 100 years, no one in the city had dared to occupy this land. Wushuang knew that the bull had taken the restaurant away and moved it to the Great Tianyuan world. According to the bull, the Great Tianyuan world was His Excellency's world. It was the only great world he had left in this world. Occasionally, he would go to the Great Tianyuan world for a walk. The spiritual energy there was very rich, and the scenery was very beautiful. He liked it very much. Most importantly, he could feel His Excellency's aura in the Great Tianyuan world. That aura fascinated him. Therefore, he would occasionally go to the Great Tianyuan world for a vacation. Now, he could be considered to be standing at the peak of this universe. However, he would not forget that everything he had was given to him by that man. Walking in the city, everything became very strange. For mortals, 100 years was a long time. The unparalleled sword god of the past was now only left in the records of legends. He walked the streets of the city on foot. Wushuang was a little nostalgic. During those 500 years, he often followed that man and walked like this. "Come on, cooking god is open again. Hurry up, or there won't be any seats left." What? Cooking god is open again? What do you think? That cooking god is definitely an immortal. My father said that when he was still in diapers, the restaurant already existed in the city. Wushuang put his hands behind his back and closed his eyes, feeling the aura in the downtown area. Suddenly, voices resounded one after another. That gave Wushuang pause. Cooking god, how bold! Even that His Excellency didn't dare to call himself cooking god. Who is it? How dare he overestimate himself? Wushuang was expressionless. The sword on his back began to tremble faintly. Chapter 1822. The God of Cooking? Ridiculous! Only that man in the world could be called the God of Cooking. Wushuang's face was cold, and a sharp sword intent flashed in his eyes, causing heaven and earth to tremble. The simple and unadorned iron sword on his back was vibrating slowly, constantly emitting rumbling sounds. He looked at the direction in which the crowd was running. With his hands clasped behind his back, Wushuang followed. He wanted to see who this so-called god of cooking was. Wushuang walked slowly along the long street. In the distance, the crowd gradually became crowded. He had not returned for 100 years, and now there was such a restaurant in the city? This was the first time he had seen such a popular restaurant since His Excellency passed away. To be able to attract so many people to line up, it must be something. For a moment, his heart was filled with a little curiosity. The front of the restaurant was bustling. Wushuang sucked in a cold breath when he saw the bustling crowd and the crowded heads of the crowd. How popular is this restaurant? His Excellency was nothing more than this in the past. Excuse me, is the food cooked by the chef in that restaurant really that good? Wushuang stopped a man in the queue and asked with a frown. Are you new here? Did you come from another city? Let me tell you, this restaurant has a long history. It's a century-old restaurant, and it's always been this popular. My father said that when he was still in diapers, this restaurant was already very popular. The man seemed to find it boring to wait in line, so he pulled Wushuang aside and began to chat. The other teammates in line also joined in the conversation. They talked about all kinds of things, and finally they talked about which brothel in the city had the prettiest girls. Wushuang left the discussion and narrowed his eyes. A century-old restaurant. He walked along the line. He came to the front. The queue stretched for 2 whole streets. It was really popular. Hey, brother, it's not good to cut the line like this, is it? Just as Wushuang walked to the front, a man in luxurious clothes at the front of the line became unhappy. He pulled Wushuang aside and said, Come on. Wushuang frowned and turned his head. What? Are you glaring at me? Let me tell you, no one is allowed to cause trouble in the God of Cooking's restaurant. Even if there are immortals, he has beaten several of them away. Do you dare to touch me? The man was very smug. He raised his chin, and his head was almost touching Wushuang's face. Wushuang watched indifferently. This person was fearless. However, he couldn't be bothered to bicker with a mortal. Wushuang turned to look in the direction of the restaurant. The door of the restaurant opened. A thin figure walked out from within. Huh! Wushuang was stunned. Outside the door, the customers in the queue were instantly excited. God of Cooking! The God of Cooking has come out! How lucky! The God of Cooking is really open for business today. I can taste the delicacies of the world again. How wonderful! The diners were extremely excited. Each and every one of them cheered. The young man in a brocade robe patted Wushuang on the shoulder and said, Brother, be a good boy and line up. Maybe you'll get to eat the God of Cooking's dishes. Wushuang ignored the young man. Instead, he stared in the direction of the restaurant. His breathing paused for a moment. That figure Bu Fang opened the door and rolled up the sleeves of his coarse linen shirt. His fair arms were exposed. Suddenly, he froze and looked out the door. Standing in front of the crowd was a familiar figure. Bu Fang raised his eyebrows. Brother, I'm not trying to scold you. Do you know that cutting in line is a bad habit? You? F***ck. The young man was still trying to reason with Wushuang. Suddenly Wushuang fell to his knees. His knees collided violently with the ground, and the ground crumbled. The young man in brocade robe was startled, and his breath caught in his throat. So fierce? For the sake of food, he even threw away his dignity? Brother, you win. But I'm giving way to you, but the people behind me won't allow it. The young man was still talking. Wushuang turned his head and glanced at the young man. The young man felt a chill run through him, and he raised his hand to cover his mouth. Damn it! I've met an expert. In front of him, Wushuang's eyes were blurred, and tears were welling up in his eyes. The young man was so frightened that he could not speak. For the sake of food, he even used his best actor skills? Bu Fang looked at Wushuang. He did not expect to meet him here. Come in. Bu Fang looked at Wushuang and said, Yes, Your Excellency. Wushuang lifted his sleeve and wiped the tears off his face. His Excellency is not dead. His Excellency is not dead. This is really great. Wushuang rose to his feet and walked straight into the restaurant. Excuse me, everyone. This is my old friend. Please make an exception for him. Bu Fang said lightly to the people waiting in line. Hey, God of Cooking, please don't laugh at us. Why would we care? Go ahead. This brother is handsome, so we don't care. If only His Excellency could open the restaurant a little longer today. The customers were very reasonable. Of course, there was nothing they could do about it. After all, Bufang's power was very terrifying. He was a big shot who did not even give face to the imperial family. A restaurant could be open for 100 years without changing its owner. This meant that the owner might be an immortal master. Wu Shuang stepped into the restaurant and looked around. He looked around the restaurant, and the familiar style brought tears to his eyes. Sword Immortal Dugu Wu Shuang, whose heart of the sword path was as firm as a rock, could not help but cry at this moment. It was too nostalgic. All of this, not bad. Your cultivation is progressing very quickly. Going out for a walk is indeed beneficial. The corners of Bufang's mouth lifted as he looked at Wu Shuang. Wu Shuang rubbed his head in embarrassment and said, "I'm not as good as you, my lord. Don't be embarrassed. You are only half a step away from becoming a saint of the Great Path." Bufang said, "Help me greet the customers. We'll talk after the service is over." Bufang said. Wu Shuang put down his sword, rolled up his sleeves, and grinned. "Leave it to Wu Shuang. Although I haven't entertained guests for more than 100 years, I don't know if my skills are rusty." Wu Shuang chuckled. Turning around, he walked to the door and began to arrange the customers in an orderly manner. The corners of Bufang's mouth twitched as he turned around and entered the kitchen. The business situation was very simple. From sunrise to sunset, a day's business was over. Wu Shuang, on the other hand, was extremely excited. Standing at the door, he kept waving and soliciting customers. This guy is addicted to soliciting customers. Well, today's business is over. Bufang could not help but remind him. Wu Shuang rubbed his head. At this moment, he did not seem to be a peerless sword immortal, but a child. He closed the restaurant. Bufang came out of the kitchen with a few dishes. He was carrying a porcelain jar of wine. "Sit down and have some," Bufang said. Then, he poured Wu Shuang a glass of wine. Wu Shuang grinned and sat down in front of Bufang. Looking at Bufang, who looked exactly the same as when he first met him, Wu Shuang felt a sense of wonder. "Your Excellency, aren't you?" Bufang picked up a mouthful of food and took a sip of wine. A blush appeared on his face. "I'm not dead, am I?" Bufang said lightly. Wu Shuang nodded. "You were dead, but you came back to life," Bufang said. Wu Shuang took a deep breath. Not only did Bufang come back to life, but his cultivation base was also unfathomable to Wu Shuang. "His Excellency is really amazing." "Your Excellency, aren't you going to see your old friend?" Wu Shuang asked, puzzled. "No, it's not the time yet." Bufang shook his head and continued to eat and drink. Wu Shuang picked up a pair of chopsticks, picked up some food and put it in his mouth. As soon as it entered his mouth, his whole body trembled. There was a look of shock in his eyes. It's delicious." It was a simple dish, but it amazed Wu Shuang. The magic power in his body surged, as if it was about to break through the barrier. That was the Saint Barrier. It had baffled countless geniuses. "Don't worry. Your foundation is still lacking. Eat more food and don't rush to break through." Wu Shuang's face turned red, and he wanted to seize the opportunity to break through the barrier. However, Bufang had appeared behind him at some point. As he shouted, he placed a palm on his shoulder. Wu Shuang's fluctuating magic power was suppressed again. Unfathomable! Bufang's aura made Wu Shuang's heart tremble. A saint of the Great Path? A chaotic saint? In just 100 years, His Excellency has returned to the peak? Bufang continued to drink. "Hurry up and eat. When you're done, I still have something to do." "You're back at the right time. Help me protect me," Bufang said. "Oh, protect me?" Wu Shuang paused. "Is His Excellency going to break through again?" Wu Shuang hurriedly picked up the bowl and stuffed the rice and the food into his mouth. As soon as he did, he narrowed his eyes and let out a few cries. "It's so King delicious. I'm so King touched. It's a familiar taste, a familiar feeling." Gulp, gulp. The wine entered his mouth. His mouth was filled with the aroma of wine. Even with his cultivation base, he felt a little drunk. Your Excellency, this wine is amazing. It's even better than the best wine in the celestial court. What kind of treasure of heaven and earth did it use to make it? Wushuang exclaimed. Rice. Bufang glanced at him and said lightly. There was no such thing as treasure of heaven and earth. All his delicacies were made from ordinary ingredient. After eating and drinking to his heart's content, Wushuang leaned back in his chair with satisfaction. For the first time in 100 years, he was so satisfied with food. Are you full? Then come with me, Bufang said. Wushuang nodded and followed them. Bufang went upstairs and went to his room. Wushuang followed obediently behind him. As soon as he opened the door of the room, Wushuang, who was behind Bufang, narrowed his eyes. Hiss! The sound of people sucking in breaths of surprise rang out. This is... Wushuang stammered, not knowing what to say. Don't be surprised. It's just the origin of some stars. Bufang said lightly. How can I not be surprised? You've shrunk the whole universe and moved it into this room, haven't you? What is your Excellency going to do? Wushuang's mind was full of questions. I'm afraid it's not enough. After all, I'm going to resurrect an old friend. The corner of Bufang's mouth twitched. I've got to give him the best. Wushuang's eyes froze. The next moment, Bufang raised his hand. With a flick of his finger, buzz, ripples appeared in the void, and a simple power slowly spread out. Wushuang narrowed his eyes. The endless origin of stars in the room all lit up as if the whole universe was operating. With his hands clasped behind his back, Bufang walked in the universe. Wushuang's body tensed up. Guard me outside the room. Well, help me hide my aura. I've set up an array in advance, but just in case, help me erase the extra aura that seeps out, Bufang said. Wushuang's eyes narrowed and then he nodded. He seemed to know what Bufang was going to do. Buzz, the iron sword on his back flew out. In a flash, thousands of swords tore through the sky. I'm here. The restaurant is here. Leave everything to me, Wushuang said resolutely. The corner of Bufang's mouth twitched slightly. With a bang, the door of the restaurant closed. The starlight disappeared. The iron sword hovered beside Wushuang, and there was a nostalgic look in his eyes. Is that iron lump coming back? My lord will succeed. Wushuang had a firm belief in his heart. The corner of his mouth twitched. With a thought in his mind, he sat cross-legged in midair. Holding the iron sword, he placed it on his legs. Meanwhile, in the restaurant, a terrifying aura suddenly burst out. Chapter 1823. During these 100 years, Bufang began to cultivate again. In fact, he didn't really focus on cultivation. Cooking was actually his cultivation. It was a process of improving himself. In this process, the improvement of his cultivation base was only a side effect. More importantly, it was the improvement of his cooking skills through the emotional path. It was an extremely mysterious situation. When Bufang woke up, he would find that he had broken through to the immortal king realm, and when he woke up again, he would find that he had become a saint of the great path. Of course, the time spent in this process was not short. For Bufang, 100 years was not a short time. It could also be called a long time. During these 100 years, as his cultivation base improved, he gradually gained a long life, a youthful face, and a more experienced emotion. He walked in the starry sky, shuttling through every dead star. He searched for the origin of a dead star, the glimmer of hope for life. In each of the stars there was one of his dishes. One dish revived a star, making the grass grow, the birds fly, and the water gurgle. Bufang, on the other hand, took the star's origin. It was a kind of exchange. A dead star was still a star, even though it had been dead for hundreds of thousands or millions of years. However, Bufang did not cut off the hope of this star. He even gave it new hope. On planet Immortality. In a restaurant in the city. Wushuang sat cross-legged in midair, holding an iron sword in one hand and looking straight at the sky with bright eyes. Why did he need to protect him? After thinking about it, Wushuang figured it out. His Excellency did not want people to know, or rather, he did not want the fluctuation to spread. So he needed to protect him. Therefore, Wushuang would do his best. With his sword blocking the way, even if a saint of the Great Path attacked, he would not be able to break through. Rumble! A rumbling sound rang out. A powerful aura began to erupt in the restaurant. Wushuang's pupils constricted. His powerful divine sense spread out in an instant. At this moment, everything on planet Immortality was enveloped by his divine sense. Nowadays, there were many sects on planet Immortality, and these were all powerful immortal cultivation sects with immortals presiding over them. These immortals came from the Your Wilds continent. At this moment, Wushuang's divine sense spread out. The immortal patriarchs of many sects opened their eyes in alarm. What a terrifying sword intent, Wushuang! That peerless sword god has returned to planet Immortality. This kind of sword will. I'm afraid it can kill a sage. Many ancestral patriarchs were trembling. The strongest among them was only an immortal king, so they did not dare to fight Wushuang head-on. So, they naturally chose not to fight him. They even asked the disciples of the immortal sects not to step into Dugu Wushuang's domain. Otherwise, they would be expelled from the immortal sect and killed without mercy. After all, with how big the sect was, there were bound to be some blind disciples who would foolishly provoke some enemies. Wushuang was domineering. If his sect was destroyed because of a disciple, it would be a great injustice. Many immortals released their auras to show their goodwill to Wushuang from afar. Of course, there were also some immortals who were curious and wanted to find out why Wushuang did this. Wushuang sat cross-legged in midair with his eyes closed. Beneath him, a simple array formation hovered around the restaurant. However, although it looked simple, it was actually very complicated. His Excellency's attainment in arrays has improved. Compared with the gourmet array, this array is even more terrifying and profound. Wushuang exclaimed. Under the cover of the array, not even the slightest aura was released. In the distance, immortal energy curled up. Many immortals were watching from afar. Scram! Wushuang said indifferently. He raised his sword and flicked it lightly with his finger. Suddenly, the cry of a sword rang out. In the distance, an immortal hiding in the void snorted coldly. Wushuang's eyes widened. Without saying a word, he slashed out with his sword. A sword pierced through the void, instantly slashing towards the immortal expert who was hiding in the void. Rumble! A terrible sword energy swept across heaven and earth. In midair, an immortal let out a miserable howl as he was cut in half by Wushuang. Scram, or I'll kill you without mercy, Wushuang said indifferently with his eyes closed. In the end, the immortals retreated. In the restaurant, endless starlight filled the air. It was a small room, but in fact, it was like a miniature starry sky. Bufang had used Sumer Universe to make the room larger than a great world. This great world, on the other hand, was only dotted with stars. These stars were not simple. They were the origin of stars. The price of the origin of stars was extremely high. They were very difficult to collect, but once they were collected, they were good materials for forging. Bufang walked among them. With his hands clasped behind his back, the corners of his mouth curled up slightly. In the past 100 years, he had collected so many stars' origins. He could have continued to collect, but he had already collected all the dead stars' origins in this region. If he wanted to continue, he could only collect the stars' origins with lives. This was contrary to his wish, so he ended the collection. He was tired of walking. Bufang sat down and raised his hand. He raised his hand. His palm was fair and untainted by a speck of dust. His eyes were soft. Buzz, a strange fluctuation spread. In an instant, The stars' origins hanging in the sky began to fly at high speed. They kept gathering in Bufang's hand. They began to gather quickly. They grew bigger and bigger. Countless star essences converged to form a giant, circular star. The star was so huge that Bufang looked like a speck of dust in it. A speck of dust that was extremely small. Bufang grabbed the star. The huge star was extremely heavy. However, Bufang's robe fluttered in the wind. He raised his other hand. A golden flame quietly spread out, instantly spreading to the whole star, and began to burn. Burned by the flame, the star shone as brightly as the sun. It was exuding supreme power. Bufang watched indifferently. Buzz, a powerful fluctuation of the law spread out. The flow of time around the star suddenly sped up tens of thousands of times. The golden flame, in a breath, was equivalent to burning the star for tens of thousands of years. It was a very mysterious feeling. Time went by little by little. Bufang controlled the golden flame to burn the star. The star's original huge shape began to shrink as it burned. On planet Immortality, time passed slowly. 1 day, 2 days, 3 days. Wushuang sat cross-legged in the void like a supreme sword god. No immortal dared to show up. Bufang was in the restaurant, quietly controlling the golden flame to burn the star. The star was getting smaller and smaller. After hundreds of millions of years, the star became the size of a house. Countless years passed again. The star was only half the size of a house now. The refinement was still going on. Bufang did not know how to refine artifacts, but, at his current level, even if he didn't understand, he could still do extremely well. He controlled the flame to burn. After a long time, Bufang stood up. He reached out his hand and slapped the star with his fair palm. He did it slowly, neither too fast nor too slow. It was like kneading a clay figurine. Before long, a huge human figure was formed. It had a round head and a fat belly. It looked somewhat familiar. The corner of Bufang's mouth twitched slightly. His movements were not slow. With every slap, the figure became clearer and clearer. He was using the essence of the star to refine a body. Once this body took shape, it would probably be comparable to a saint of the Great Path. The body gradually became clearer, and an oppressive aura fluctuated. However, this was just a body. Without a soul, what it lacked was a kind of agility. On planet Immortality, Rumble, the whole planet underwent a great change at this moment. In a flash, the density of spiritual energy on planet Immortality skyrocketed like boiling water. Colorful light bloomed in the sky, and the sound of the Great Path rang out. Chains of law fell from the sky. Auspicious dragons, divine phoenixes, and all kinds of auspicious signs appeared between heaven and earth. Wushuang could not help but take a deep breath when he saw this phenomenon. It had begun. This was the most important moment. Wushuang rose to his feet, holding the iron sword with one hand. The sword was simple and unremarkable. It was made for him by Tongtian, a perfected saint of the primitive universe. Although Tongtian did not accept him as a disciple, he thought highly of his swordsmanship. Therefore, he gave the sword to Wushuang. It was a simple sword, even a little ugly, but it was very easy for Wushuang to wield. In the distance, immortals appeared together. Wushuang's eyes shone brightly. I said, "Cram." He said coldly. A terrible murderous aura towered into the sky. Although he was only a half-step saint, his strength was no weaker than that of a saint of the Great Path. Wushuang, don't be too domineering. When treasures of heaven and earth appear, only those who are fated can have them. Don't think you're really invincible. You'll fight to the death if you cut off a man's path of cultivation. Wushuang, if you have what it takes, let's have a fair competition. The immortals shouted. Their voices were like thunder, constantly resounding in the sky. These immortals were all from the primitive universe, and their power was unparalleled. There was no doubt that the phenomenon and the feeling of spiritual energy surging were the birth of treasures of heaven and earth. How could they give up this opportunity? They were all seeking the Tao on the path of immortality. Since they were seeking the Tao, they naturally would not give up this once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. Only those who are fated can have them? Wu Shuang twitched the corner of his mouth and shook his head. Who do you think you are? How dare you call yourselves fated? How presumptuous! The immortals flew into a rage. Although Wu Shuang was strong, he looked down on them like this, which made them angry. However, Wu Shuang had his domineering air. His cultivation base was a half-step saint, so many people did not dare to be presumptuous. Rumble! Wu Shuang grabbed the sword. The sword slashed at the void. The tide of spiritual energy was cleaved right through the middle, and all the immortals retreated in terror. Rumble! Above the 9 heavens, there was a terrifying pressure pressing down. It was the arrival of many half-step saints. These half-step saints were all looking for an opportunity to break through to the saint realm. How could they let go of the treasures of planet immortality? Perhaps with the help of these treasures, they could become saints overnight. Rumble! Rumble! There was no doubt that these half-step saints were summoned by these immortals. However, Wu Shuang was fearless. Grabbing the iron sword, he let out a loud cry and swung it. He did not flinch in the face of these half-step saints. I said, "All of you, get the hell out of here." Countless half-step saints launched terrible attacks and collided with Wu Shuang's sword energy. Heaven and earth shattered, and planet immortality trembled violently. When these fluctuations approached the array, they were directly neutralized by it. Moreover, the city, which was enveloped by the array, was not damaged in the slightest. Whether they were mortals or cultivators, they all knelt on the ground, shivering and not daring to breathe loudly. When immortals fought, mortals suffered. They did not know when a disaster would befall them. When immortals fought, destroying a country was nothing. The light aftershock was enough to kill them. However, this time, the shockwave was actually blocked. Many mortals looked blankly in the direction of the restaurant. In the restaurant, Bufang looked at the iron lump in front of him and breathed a sigh of relief. It was the same as the one in Xiaobai's books. The familiar look made Bufang feel nostalgic. It had been many years since he last saw it. The god of cooking's will had disappeared. Xiaobai could not hold on for too long. The only reason he could hold on for 500 years was that he had absorbed a lot of energy from the soul demons. After Bufang died of old age, Xiaobai was taken back by the god of cooking. Xiaobai was created by the god of cooking, so he would naturally be taken back after his merits were fulfilled. Bufang, on the other hand, no longer needed Xiaobai. Looking at Xiaobai, who was emotionless and lifeless, Bufang breathed a sigh of relief. Even though he had refined a body, a soulless Xiaobai was not Xiaobai. Bufang took a step back. He raised his hand. A quaint cooking utensil emerged in his palm. Bufang began to cook a dish. There was a complicated look in his eyes, with many emotions swirling in them. Xiaobai had no soul, and Xiaobai was no longer in the transmigration. It was basically impossible to resurrect Xiaobai, because Xiaobai had truly disappeared from heaven and earth. However, in Bufang's view, there was nothing that could not be solved with one dish. If there was, then he would cook too. Ingredients flew in all directions as Bufang cooked unhurriedly. The iron lump stood mercilessly in the distance. Bufang's movements were as smooth as flowing water. He opened the steamer, and hot steam billowed out. There was only a steamed bun in the steamer. The bun was white and tender, with a round head and a fat belly. Bufang took it out. The corner of Bufang's mouth twitched slightly as he felt the heat. Memories flooded his eyes, and he thought of many things. Starting from the Light Wind Empire, memories about Xiaobai kept surging in his mind. The white bun Xiaobai's eyes seemed to slowly brighten. They glowed with golden light. Looking at the white bun Xiaobai in his hand, Bufang raised the corner of his mouth. Then, He walked to the front of the giant iron lump. The latter's round belly instantly turned into a bottomless black hole. Bufang put the white bun Xiaobai in it. Slowly, it was like sinking to the bottom of the sea. The white bun Xiaobai gradually disappeared. However, its golden eyes were getting brighter and brighter. Bufang took a step back. The origin of stars in the surroundings had all been used, making the starry sky pitch black. However, in this pitch-black darkness, two beams of golden light suddenly shot out. The iron lump raised its fan-like palm, scratching its round head. Xiaobai, come back. Bufang exhaled and said in an indifferent voice. Chapter 1824. Whitey raised its hand and scratched its round head. Its mechanical eyes emitted a dazzling golden light. His mechanical eyes burst into a dazzling golden light as he looked at Bufang. Bufang put his hands behind his back, looked at Xiaobai in the dark, and could not help but nod. Xiao Chen raised his hand and patted Little White's round belly. The feedback he received was not as cold as before. Instead, it felt a little warm. Xiaobai scratched his head. Bufang looked at Xiaobai and felt that Xiaobai seemed to have gained a little more humanity. It was a familiar feeling and aura. Xiaobai is finally back. Wu Shuang stood in the sky, one man and one sword. As a sword immortal, his fighting prowess was extraordinary, and the last thing he was afraid of was numbers. In the distance, many immortals were approaching from the void. The light that burst out of the restaurant became more and more obvious, as if it was going to break through the sky and shatter the clouds. The immortals were getting more and more excited. This level of light was the light that could help one attain the Tao. It seemed to be on par with the 10 great divine artifacts of the primitive universe. How could they give up such an opportunity? Several half-step saints could not help but attack. Powerful fluctuations of magic power swept through heaven and earth. All kinds of magic treasures fell from the sky. Wu Shuang, on the other hand, was fearless. Holding an iron sword, he swung it back. A terrible sword intent soared into the sky. It collided with the magic treasures of many immortals. Although Bufang had said that a little energy would leak in the process of resurrecting his old friend, the leakage of this light was not just a little. However, Wu Shuang did not care. Since His Excellency had asked him to guard the restaurant, he would not let these people step into the restaurant even if he had to die. The half-saint experts emerged together in midair, and all of them had shocked expressions on their faces. A half-step saint sword immortal was indeed terrifying. One man and one sword actually rendered them helpless. Some of the magic treasures were even cut in half by Wu Shuang's sword. The mortals below were all dumbfounded. This kind of aura, this kind of aura, this kind of aura of one person against 10,000 immortals was simply too cool. Some of the veteran half-step saints flew into a rage out of humiliation. Wu Shuang had only stepped into the Tao for a few hundred years, yet he was able to block the joint attack of so many half-step saints. However, when he thought about how Wu Shuang had followed that man for 500 years, it made sense. However, that man had already passed away. They would not hand over the opportunity to Wu Shuang just like that. They hoped to use this opportunity to become a saint of the Great Path, so how could they give up so easily? Fight! A huge bronze cauldron appeared in the sky and smashed down toward Wu Shuang. Around the cauldron, all kinds of magical treasures floated and sank, forming a terrifying array. As the array trembled, energy blasted at Wu Shuang, causing the restaurant's array to glow with colorful light. Wu Shuang sneered. Holding the sword, he performed the sword technique. He danced alone in the void. His sword was not the kind of sword that swung with great force. Instead, it was a soft sword. As he swung it, it was as if emotions were bursting forth from within. As he danced with his sword, he sang a sword song. At this moment, Wu Shuang's aura kept rising. It was as if he had broken through to the level of a saint of the Great Path. The terrible fighting prowess of a sword immortal was brought out by him to the extreme. Rumble! The bronze cauldron was cut in half by the sword. The immortal controlling the bronze cauldron coughed up blood and flew backward, his face pale and unsightly. Many magical treasures were destroyed by the sword energy. One slash after another, it was extremely powerful. Wushuang's 7 Emotions Sword Song. One of the half-step saints said with a serious face. Wushuang held the sword and said indifferently, "Get out of here." The faces of the other half-step saints turned unsightly. The immortals who were watching secretly sucked in their breath. The mortals down below roared with excitement. "He's so cool." Sword God Dugu defeated all the immortals with one sword. Suddenly Wushuang frowned. He looked into the distance. There, immortal energy swirled around him. A golden staff fell from the sky. Beams of golden light burst out of it. A Buddha's head emerged, radiating dazzling golden light. Wushuang narrowed his eyes. The Buddha of a saint of the Great Path. Did he attract a saint of the Great Path after all? Wushuang took a deep breath, but he did not find it strange. After all, it's not surprising that something made by His Excellency has attracted a saint of the Great Path. Benefactor. Let me have a look. If the treasure is not mine, I'll leave immediately, the Buddha said with a smile. When the Buddha smiled, he looked charmingly naive. However, Wushuang was too lazy to pay attention to him. This was what the Buddha meant. If it was fated, he would take it. How could there be such a good thing? If you want me to let you have it, you'll have to ask my sword first. Wushuang bowed his head and said indifferently. Sword intent erupted from his body, turned into a peerless sword, and went straight for the Buddha. The Buddha was a saint of the Great Path, so Wushuang did not dare to be careless. Although he was a sword immortal, the strength of a saint of the Great Path was very terrifying, so he had to go all out. In that case, I'll have to offend you. The Buddha smiled and shook his head. Then, he performed a Buddhist incantation gesture and threw it at Wushuang. Wushuang gripped the sword and slashed it out. In the boundless starry sky outside planet Immortality, many terrifying auras were watching. There was no doubt that the light had already alarmed the primitive universe. The Buddha's incantation gesture collided with the sword light. Wushuang gave a muffled snort, and his indomitable sword intent was forced to a halt. However, he was fearless. He laughed, sang a sword song, and danced with his sword in the starry sky. Every strike was filled with unparalleled emotions, and within those emotions was a killing intent that filled the sky. The sword moved like a dragon. Although the Buddha was a saint of the Great Path, he was suppressed. Frowning, Wushuang held the golden staff in his hand. The golden rings on the staff collided with each other, producing a tinkling sound. Rumble! The sword energy and the Buddha's light collided in midair, causing explosions. Wushuang felt extremely strained. Rumble! All of a sudden, outside planet Immortality, another expert made a move. He was also a saint of the Great Path, and his terrible aura blotted out the sky. This time it was a Taoist. Sitting cross-legged in the starry sky, his eyes gleaming, he threw out a huge hand that blotted out the sky. Wushuang roared and slashed at the hand with his sword. Bam! His body suddenly trembled violently, causing his chi and blood to rumble. However, this was not the end. He seemed to have sensed Wushuang's limit. Outside the starry sky, another expert made a move. A spear tore through the sky and went straight for Wushuang's chest. It was a barbarian clad in animal skin, his eyes gleaming. On planet Immortality, the mortals were forced to kneel on the ground, not daring to move at all. The pressure was too great. When immortals fought, they could only watch in fear. Wushuang was forced to retreat. His iron sword was as red as a soldering iron. The magic power of a saint of the Great Path hit him so hard that it seemed to be on the verge of breaking. Crack! A line spread across the iron sword. Then, a boom rang out. In Wu Shuang's eyes, the iron sword cracked in an instant. Rumble! The Buddha, the Taoist, and the barbarian landed on planet immortality at the same time. They rushed madly toward the treasure light. All the auspicious signs were dispersed. The three of them attacked at the same time. Their terrible auras suppressed the sky. Wu Shuang's eyes narrowed. Get lost! He turned into a sword and slashed out. Suddenly, a thin figure appeared beside him. He pressed his shoulder. It's all right. It's over. Bufang appeared and said lightly. Wu Shuang paused, then a look of joy came over his face as he looked at Bufang. His Excellency is here. Everything will be fine. Bufang glanced at the broken iron sword. He raised his hand. The fragments of the iron sword fell into Bufang's hand. He raised his hand. The source of stars fell into his hand. Good. There's still a little bit left. I can help you repair the iron sword, Bufang said. His mental force spread like a spring breeze. Soon, the iron sword was restored to its original state. It was still an ordinary iron sword. However, there seemed to be a strange feeling in it. When Wu Shuang held it, he felt a dependence in the depths of his soul. It was the resonance of the emotional path. The resonance of Wu Shuang's 7 emotions, sword path, and the emotional path. Your Excellency. What about them? Wu Shuang said, holding the iron sword. It doesn't matter. Let's wait and see. This is a good opportunity for an old friend to practice. The corner of Bufang's mouth twitched. There seemed to be a hint of playfulness in his eyes. That gave Wu Shuang pause. Rumble! The Buddha, the Taoist, and the barbarian approached the restaurant. They raised their hands, trying to grab the spot where the light was coming from. Suddenly, the door of the restaurant was pushed open. The three of them froze. A huge figure walked out of the restaurant. Xiaobai appeared with a round head and a round belly. His golden mechanical eyes swiveled as he stared at the three experts in midair. He did not seem to have any aura of magic power. What is this? The three experts paused. Who cares what he is? Let's beat him up. The barbarian grabbed the spear and threw it at Xiaobai. The terrifying sound of something tearing through the air emitted a violent sound. A saint of the great path was quite terrifying. Xiaobai's mechanical eyes flashed. He raised his hand. Then, his huge palm grabbed the spear. There was a cracking sound. The spear was crushed by Xiaobai. The Buddha, the Taoist, and the barbarian were shocked. The barbarian's eyes burned like torches. All of a sudden, there was a flash of light. Whitey's body disappeared on the spot. When he reappeared, he landed in front of the three experts. The barbarian was shocked. He threw a punch. This punch was powerful and heavy, and the terrifying fluctuations almost caused the void to collapse. Bam! However, the punch hit Xiaobai's huge palm, but it did not cause any ripples. Terrifying! Unfathomable! The barbarian was shocked. He stared at Xiaobai. All of a sudden, his pupils constricted, as if he had thought of something. You're an iron puppet, boom! Xiaobai slapped him in the face. The barbarian was stunned and swallowed the words he was about to say. Rip! The animal's skin was torn. The barbarian's body was exposed to the void just like that. The mortals below let out cries of surprise. The corner of Wu Shuang's mouth twitched. In the distance, the Buddha and the Taoist were also shocked. The more they looked at Xiaobai, the more familiar they felt. The sense of familiarity that enveloped their hearts made their hearts throb. It was as if they had thought of something terrible. The Buddha grabbed his staff and was about to retreat. The Taoist also flew away. However, Xiaobai's mechanical eyes swept over. With a sweep of his fan-like palm, he directly pulled the two of them back. Troublemakers will be stripped as an example to others, Xiaobai said. His voice was no longer as mechanical and cold as before. On the contrary, there was a sense of rhythm to the music. What the F***ck? The Taoist was shocked. He had a bad feeling. Rip! The Taoist robe, which was an immortal artifact, was torn to pieces. The Buddha was the same. He watched in despair as his robe was torn to pieces and floated in the air. The crazy clothes stripping demon. He was back. Chapter 1825. Xiaobai had returned. In midair, Wu Shuang was inexplicably excited. Although he wasn't very familiar with the metal puppet by his master's side, it had been a few hundred years, and that metal puppet had long been his companion and friend. In fact, Wu Shuang knew very well that the iron puppet was not really a puppet. It actually had emotions. However, that kind of emotion was like a small seed, deeply planted in the depths of his heart. As long as it was watered, it would bloom. And now that flower could be considered to have completely bloomed. You're quite energetic, and your skills are not rusty. In midair, Bufang nodded faintly. He seemed to be quite satisfied with Xiao Bai's means. Xiao Bai's skill of stripping was as strong as ever. Even an immortal could be stripped in one move. So what if the opponent was a saint of the Great Path? He could still strip them and throw them out. The origin of almost all the dead stars in the universe had fused into Xiao Bai's body. He had used the best equipment and was catalyzed by delicious food. Now, Xiao Bai could be considered to have been reborn. Bufang did not know how strong his fighting capacity was. Perhaps he had surpassed Xiao Bai, or perhaps he was even stronger. The Buddha, the Taoist, and the barbarian were all stripped by Xiao Bai with one move. They could not resist at all. They seemed to remember something. This puppet, it seemed to be famous in the primitive universe. But hadn't it been reduced to dust? Why did they meet it on this ordinary planet? Such a fearsome existence was not weaker than a chaotic saint. The Taoist, the Buddha, and the barbarian were all the top experts in their respective worlds, but at this moment, they had no confidence in facing Xiao Bai. He was too strong. He stripped them in one move, whether it was their Taoist robes, kasayas, or even their animal skins. The spiritual energy that filled the air after the magic artifacts were torn to pieces drifted in the air. Watering heaven and earth had benefited planet immortality. The mortals could feel the energy flowing out of the magic artifacts, and their bodies were getting stronger. More and more mortals knelt on the ground. These were all real immortals. Xiao Bai's golden mechanical eyes scanned the area. The Taoist, the Buddha, and the barbarian stiffened. Without hesitation, they wrapped themselves in their clothes and flew across the void. He had escaped. With such a puppet around, there was no need for them to fight for treasures. It would be good enough if they could survive. In fact, they had no idea that the treasure they sought was the puppet itself. The Taoist, the Buddha, and the barbarian left. Bufang did not try to stop him. In fact, there was no need to intercept them. The latter wasn't wrong either. It was the nature of cultivators to pursue natural treasures. Boom! Xiao Bai took a step forward. As if he had crossed the river of time, he appeared in front of Bufang. He raised his fan-like hand and rubbed his head. He patted White E's belly and twitched the corner of his mouth. Wu Shuang sheathed his iron sword. After being refined by Bufang, the sword was now as powerful as a divine artifact of the primitive universe. Wu Shuang naturally took good care of it. Putting away the sword, he cupped his fist and bowed to Xiao Bai. Xiao Bai also raised his fan-like hand in a daze and mimicked the latter's gesture. Compared with the former Xiao Bai, the current Xiao Bai could be said to have just awakened his intelligence. However, many things that belonged to the former Xiao Bai were deeply engraved in his memory. Xiao Bai was still the same Xiao Bai, but he was a little more humane than the cold iron puppet Xiao Bai. Bufang clasped his hands behind his back. He looked down at the mortals below. He raised his hand and waved it gently. His magic power spread out, and the mortal world immediately tumbled. Everything returned to normal. The array dissipated. Xiao Bai, Wu Shuang, and Bufang landed in the restaurant one after another. Your Excellency! Are you going to stay here forever? Wushuang asked. He was very excited about Bufang's resurrection. He could not even tell how strong Bufang was now. In any case, he was at least stronger than him. Even if he used the 7 emotions sword path, he might not be able to defeat Bufang. Isn't it good to stay here? Go out more in the mortal world. Even if you want to leave in the future, you won't have the chance. The corner of Bufang's mouth lifted slightly. He was not in a hurry. There were still nearly 400 years before Soul God woke up. Besides, with Bufang's current cultivation base, he might not be able to defeat Soul God. He still needed to cultivate slowly and reach the peak of the emotional cooking path. Wushuang did not understand. He nodded and said nothing. However, he and Bufang both had endless life now, so he was not in a hurry. Wherever Bufang went, he would go and he would follow him until his death. In the Temple of Heaven God time, Lord Go lay lazily outside the Heaven God Temple, basking in the sun. He had no choice but to bask in the sun. He had no sweet and sour ribs, so he could only waste his time like this. Basking in the sun, a day passed. Hades' era, on the other hand, was a lot more unrestrained. He did not eat the spicy strip but kept it for himself. Bufang's dishes were immortal, so they would not rot even after hundreds of years. From time to time, when he wanted to eat them, he would take out the spicy strip and take a bite. Of course, he had to restrain himself, or he would finish it in less than a year. Little Who was very naughty. After all, Heaven God Destruction could blow up the chaos space with a meatball he spat out. Xiaopi was somewhat like Lord Go. He basked in the sun and blew bubbles every day. Heaven God Space, who could go anywhere, had become a lazy guy who could not even be bothered to move. Without Bufang, they all became dispirited. Time passed. Another 100 years passed in a flash. For the chaos space, 100 years was nothing. For Void City, 100 years did not seem to feel like it had passed at all. It seemed like it was only yesterday that Hua came to deliver the dish. In Void City, Hua had also settled down, sitting cross-legged and cultivating. At first, Flowery wanted to stay at Lord Dog's place. However, Nethery was receiving the inheritance. She thought about it and decided to stay. It could be considered protecting Nethery. In Hangu Pass, the towering pass was split in half from the middle, looking a ghastly sight. Immortals and deities sat cross-legged on the pass, fusing their powerful magic power into the void and filling up the array. The dish was surrounded by densely packed formations. Each of them seemed to contain supreme pressure. However, what was truly shocking was, the dishes in the array formation were bitten again and again and again. Half of the dish was eaten. This caused fear to spread in the hearts of many people. It was as if that battle was still vivid in their minds. They could not forget the terrible scene of Soul God's emergence and the shaking of heaven and earth. Buzz, a beam of sword light soared into the sky. Tong Tian hovered in midair, stepping on an immortal sword and flying around the array. He looked at the dish. It seemed to have formed a realm of its own, suppressing Soul God in it. Tong Tian put his hands behind his back, his Taoist robe flapping noisily in the wind. He stared at the half-eaten dish, feeling a little uneasy. For perfected chaotic saints like them, 1,000 years was just a snap of their fingers. However, time passed like a year for him. It was as if there was an hourglass of death that kept flowing, and when it ran out, there would be endless destruction. This time, there was no Bufang. No one could suppress Soul God with a dish anymore. He sighed. Tong Tian performed a sword incantation gesture again. A beam of light descended from the sky and smashed into the formation, causing ripples to appear on it. Continue to suppress him. I also have a sword, and I'm just waiting for you to come out. Tong Tian narrowed his eyes. He stared at the incomplete dish with a fierce look in his eyes. Bufang closed the restaurant's door. Then, he gently closed it. Xiao Bai and Gudu Wushuang came over. Your Excellency, Why are you closing so early today? Wu Shuang was a little puzzled. Xiao Bai blinked his mechanical eyes. I have to go somewhere today. Pack up and we'll go for a walk. Bufang said. Wu Shuang paused. Then, he nodded. After a while, this guy ran into the room and carried his sword on his back. Except when he was helping with the business, he did not carry his sword. At other times, he would carry it on his back. This was the professionalism of a sword immortal. Bufang did not say anything. Looking at Wu Shuang's sword, Bufang could not help but think of the god of cooking set. The god of cooking set and the gourmet array had melted and suppressed Soul God. Bufang did not have a good weapon now. Pack up and we'll set out, Bufang said. Wu Shuang nodded, and so did Xiao Bai. The current Whitey was becoming more and more intelligent, more and more human-like. With his hands clasped behind his back, Bufang took a step forward. The void twisted and turned into a huge spatial tunnel. He was the first to step into it. Wu Shuang and Whitey exchanged a glance and followed after Wu Qi. Space swirled. When the three of them reappeared, they were over a vast sea. Where is this? The spiritual energy here is so thin. It's even thinner than that of planet Immortality. Wu Shuang could not help but say after sensing for a while. This is the place where I was born, Bufang said. Wu Shuang froze for a moment, and a slightly embarrassed expression appeared on his face. Sure enough, Your Excellency is extraordinary. You can cultivate to such a supreme realm in such a barren place. You're really a role model for all cultivators. Bufang glanced at Wu Shuang. After hundreds of years, your abilities have not improved, but your mouth has become much smoother. Wu Shuang laughed dryly. Bufang looked at the boundless sea and exhaled. His emotions were somewhat complicated when he returned to this place. Earth, in that battle in the end, Soul God seemed to have pulled Earth out of the endless void. Now that he thought about it, his last body should be sealed on Earth. Bufang frowned, closed his eyes, and sensed the world with his mind. The wind blew and the sea churned. The world was silent. He could not sense any fluctuation of Soul God's aura at all. What's going on? Did Soul God make a mistake? Bufang thought for a while. He took a step forward. Step by step, he ascended to the 9th heaven as if he were stepping on a flight of stairs. Bufang did not deliberately release his aura. However, the immortals on Penglai Island, Kunlun Immortal Mountain, and the other blessed caves all felt their hearts palpitate. They sat cross-legged in their cave abodes and looked up at the sky. They felt an extremely terrible aura floating between heaven and earth. The feeling made them unable to muster the slightest will to resist. Bufang ignored these immortals and deities. Instead, he entered the void. High up in the sky, amid the rolling clouds, he found a huge cave entrance. Xiao Bai and Wu Shuang followed curiously. Bufang walked toward the mouth of the cave, took a step and stepped into it. The entrance was pitch black. Sitting cross-legged in it were 3 stalwart figures. They seemed to sense Bufang's aura. The eyes of the 3 abruptly opened. Rumble! Behind Bufang, Wu Shuang's heart trembled as he felt a tremendous pressure bearing down on him. He was horrified. He could not believe that such a barren place was guarded by such an expert. In the distance, the man who opened his eyes and saw Bufang burst out laughing. Ha 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 ha! You're finally back! Chapter 1826. You're finally back. It was a familiar tone. Bufang nodded. It was none other than Serene, the human emperor. He was the supreme human emperor who protected the ancestral planet with his life. In the cave, a bonfire was burning. Bufang sat down cross-legged beside it. With Soul God suppressed, the 3 human emperors seemed to be much more relaxed. At least, they were not as depressed as they were the first time they came. Stop staring. I'm the only one left in the cave now. After Soul God was subdued, Those two old geezers simply left behind a clone and transformed into the homeworld to roam the mortal realm. I wonder how many kids they'll bring with them when they return next time. Swearin said with a hearty smile as he sat beside the bonfire. He looked curiously at Bufang. Bufang's return was not beyond his expectation. He had felt that Bufang was extraordinary, had a unique aptitude, and had a limitless future. Now it seemed that he was right. For example, he could not see through Bufang's cultivation base now. In the distance, Xiao Bai and Wushuang also came over. "Hey, sit down and have a chat with me." Swearin narrowed his eyes and smiled. Without the pressure brought by the soul demons, he became a little bored. With the soul demons no longer attacking Earth's barrier, he did not even have barbecue to eat. Wushuang was not used to Swearin's enthusiasm. However, he also understood that this should be an old senior, whose aura was much stronger than his. He was a chaotic saint-level expert. Bufang nodded. Then, he and Swearin sat in front of the bonfire and began to chat. They were really just chatting. For example, what he had seen and heard during his 500 years as a mortal. After he came back to life, he talked about the insights he gained from opening a restaurant, the interesting things he did when he traveled the starry sky, and so on. For the first time, Wushuang realized that His Excellency could talk so much. Xiao Bai stared at the bonfire with his mechanical eyes in a daze. Sometimes, Swearin would stroke his beard and laugh when he heard Bufang talk about things. Sometimes, he would nod his head with deep emotions. The years he had experienced were much longer than Bufang's. There were many things that he had a deeper understanding of than Bufang. Wushuang did not interrupt the conversation between the old man and the young man. Time passed. The sky darkened and then brightened. Bufang sat cross-legged in the cave and didn't say anything. The cave was very quiet. All that was left was the sound of sparks flying. After a long time, Swearin let out a long sigh. "It's rare for you to be able to persevere. It's really tiring to persevere on the same path." Swearenchi said. This sigh was filled with emotion. As a human sovereign, he was supposed to be supreme, but he was willing to protect the ancestral planet with his life. He almost died when the soul demons invaded. All of this came from the determination in his heart. Now, he could only be a listener, listening to Bufang's story. He did not have the ability to help Bufang. They finished chatting. Bufang began to take out one ingredient after another from his storage space. These ingredients couldn't be considered ordinary. Their auras were as strong as those of a saint of the Great Path. Their auras were as weak as those of mortal ingredient. When Bufang cooked today, he would not pursue the pinnacle of ingredient. He only looked for ingredients that caught his eye, and as long as they caught his eye, he would use them to cook. Moreover, the combination of different ingredients could produce unique sparks. Perhaps this was the charm of cooking. What Bufang took out was the leg of a saint of the Great Path bird. It was a very large leg. Bufang took out a wooden frame and inserted it into the leg. Then, he placed it over the flame and began to roast it. I can finally eat your dishes again. I've been craving them for hundreds of years, but I haven't had a bite of meat yet. Now I can finally have my fill." Swearin rubbed his hands with an expectant look on his face. Wushuang was a little speechless. This old senior is really straightforward. Bufang's face was expressionless. When it came to cooking, he was much more serious and serious. His cooking method was completely different from before. He no longer pursued fancy technique. Instead, it was a kind of emotional integration. As the flame roasted the ingredients inch by inch, the color of the bird leg began to change. Grease flowed down from the top. When the oil dripped into the bonfire, the flames immediately flared up. Bufang slowly rotated the grill at an even speed, neither too fast nor too slow. A delicious aroma wafted out of it. It was the aroma of meat, the kind that would linger in one's heart as soon as it came out. It made people unable to extricate themselves and unable to control their emotions. It smells so good. Swearin roared, his face flushed. Wushuang watched in shock. Hey, I'm sorry. I was too excited. It's been a long time since I smelled something delicious, Swearin said with a smile. He rubbed his hands and wiped his beard, his saliva almost dripping down. The corner of Bufang's mouth curved upward. His movements remained the same. While the grill was roasting, he took out a blue and white porcelain bowl and handed it to Swearin, Wushuang, and Xiao Bai. The meat became more golden, and a rich aroma wrapped around the bird leg like silk. With a shake of his hand, Bufang produced a dagger made of the origin of stars. He pressed his thumb against the back of the dagger and slowly cut it. A piece of roast meat was cut off and the oil flowed. He threw it into Swearin's porcelain bowl. Impatiently, Swearin picked up the roast meat and stuffed it into his mouth, ignoring the heat. The moment he stuffed it into his mouth, Swearin froze. This roast meat. It was completely different from the roast meat he ate. What was that gurgling? It was an emotion, an indescribable emotion. Swearin's eyes were blurred as he chewed the roast meat in his mouth. He seemed to recall many scenes. At that time, he was still a young man walking on the ancestral planet. The whole ancestral planet was dark, and he, with the indomitable spirit of a young man, brought the first ray of light in the dark to the ancestral planet. As time went by, the young man's hair had turned white. Swearin sighed as he chewed the roast meat. Before he knew it, he had lived for so many years. He sniffled. Then, he stuffed another piece of roast meat that Bufang handed to him into his mouth, wiped his greasy beard, and felt very happy. My roasting skills are not as good as yours. If your roast meat is the second best under the starry sky, no one will dare to call themselves the best. I promise. Swearin wiped the tears from the corners of his eyes. Bufang's cooking skills had grown too fast. In the past, Bufang might have been a superb cook, but when it came to roasting meat, Swearin was only on par with him. But now Swearin felt that he should be responsible for eating. Wushuang was also eating the roast meat. He felt the passage of time, and the hundreds of years he had spent with Bufang also filled him with emotion. Xiao Bai held the roast meat, opened its mechanical mouth, and put it into it. Ding! Xiao Bai's mechanical eyes suddenly lit up, and a pink flush seemed to appear on the white steel. Xiao Bai clapped its hands mechanically, praising the delicious roast meat. The corner of Bufang's mouth twitched slightly. He used a dagger to cut the meat on the bird's leg. Pieces of bird leg meat were cut off and placed on the plate. As the fire improved, the meat became softer and more fragrant. Swearin was very satisfied. The three of them ate happily. The joy of tasting delicious food was the purest joy of a person. After eating, Bufang took out some wine and poured a cup for Swearin. After eating the roast meat, they drank a small cup of wine. Swearin felt that there was nothing more beautiful in life than this. After eating and drinking, Bufang began to talk about the important topic. Of course, Soul God is sealed. He seems to be looking for something from the ancestral planet. Do you know what it is, human emperor? Bufang was puzzled. Swearin took a sip of wine and stroked his beard. Soul God needs a perfect fleshly body to return to heaven and earth. So what do you think he lacks? Swearin asked. One of Soul God's hands is in the chaotic universe, his lower body is in Void City, his head, his upper body, and the other hand are in the primitive universe and the soul demon universe. What does he lack? Bufang was puzzled. He's lacking a heart. Swearin took another sip of wine. The imperial concubine was lying on the ground, her face reflected in the light of the fire. Lacking a heart. Soul God lacked a heart? Bufang was taken aback. Soul God walks the ruthless path. Does he need a heart? Bufang frowned. The heart is the source of power. Whether it's ruthless or emotional, it all depends on the existence of a heart. So, Soul God will never spare Earth. Swearin heaved a sigh. So what if he was ruthless? Only when he had a heart could he be ruthless. Without a heart, he would have no emotions, and he would never reach the peak. Ruthlessness was also a kind of emotion. Suerin's words plunged Bufang into deep thought. Clearly, he had not expected this. Where was Soul God's heart on Earth? Bufang did not know any of this. Perhaps he should go to Earth and look for it? Don't waste your energy. You can't find it, unless Soul God comes back to life and comes to look for it himself. Suerin seemed to have seen through everything. Bufang nodded. He stopped thinking about it. Wushuang and Xiao Bai were eating barbecued meat in a daze. They could not help with these problems. In the next few days, Bufang stayed in the cave. He cooked all kinds of delicious food. Suerin was so happy that he did not want Bufang to leave. However, he also knew that Bufang would definitely leave. He could not stay here forever. Finally, a month later, Bufang left with Xiao Bai and Wushuang. Standing at the entrance of the black hole with his hands clasped behind his back, Suerin sighed as he watched Bufang leave. He was going to start the days of not eating meat again. Time flew, and before he knew it, another few hundred years had passed. The atmosphere in the world had become more and more different. It was as if the soul demon universe, which had been sealed off, was in an uproar once again. The soul demons had reappeared in the world. The 7 sin great soul overlords, who had been sacrificed by Soul God, now had new candidates. One after another, soul demons appeared in the primitive universe, the chaotic universe, and outside Void City. There were even many small universes that were completely wiped out by the soul demons. Everything about the soul demons was born from the Soul God. Therefore, even though the Soul God had sacrificed 7 sin great soul overlords, the soul demons still followed his lead. Their goal was still to resurrect Soul God. Soul God was the soul of all soul demons. On this day, in Hangu Pass, a dish hovered in the universe. Now there was only one bite left. The monstrous power of the great sin swirled around it as if it had turned into a monstrous demon. Its terrible aura made the whole universe tremble. Buzz around the dish, numerous formations were activated by his aura, emitting a supreme pressure. A round black bead seemed to have formed around the dish. Black smoke swirled in the bead. Suddenly, it turned into an eye. The scarlet eye stared coldly at the outside world, at Hangu Pass. Damn, chef! You're tuning in to the Phoenix Knights YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe and join us on this journey to catch the most captivating stories.